on gaining height to find the other members of the squad, and the Baroker kneeled. It offered its hand to me, and somehow I knew what it wanted. I climbed into its palm, and it lifted me into the air. When its hand reached its head, it allowed me to climb out again, and I stood between the horns on its iron helmet. Now this was a view. I had to be upwards of 40 feet higher than I was on the ground, and it offered me a whole new perspective of the shadowscape. From up here, I was able to take in more than I had ever thought possible. I could see over the destroyed Xanyar stone walls that no longer stood in one piece in this realm. Buildings suffered char marks, or had outright collapsed, and the roads were littered with remnants of what used to make Varley the bustling enclave that it was. The academy was in shambles too. The main building was the only part that remained somewhat intact. Everything else was reduced to nothing. Even the bathhouse, which I remembered was little more than ruins and hot water the last time I had been inside of the shadowscape within the walls of the academy, was now little more than a giant murky pond, surrounded by what little remained of the structure in the first place. It left me to wonder whether or not a rift that opened up in the same place twice was a reflection of what had happened since the prior incident, or if it somehow changed the state of destruction each time. I had a hunch that it was the former, but it was still something to ask for future reference. I never knew what information like that might come in handy. As I surveyed the surrounding area, I noticed that Gawain and the little girl that resembled the angel were nowhere to be found. It was as though they had vanished from this realm of existence too. I swore under my breath, then went on to look for Varleth and Aaron. Thankfully, that didn't take long to find. I spotted them fairly close by from my perspective, near where the outer edge of the campus wall was that blocked it off from the rest of Varley. I also spotted a monster, a cyclops, but it looked different from any of the others I'd ever seen. From a distance, it looked to be a storm variant, which was rare for most any kind of monster. There were air, thunder, and water variants, but there were few monsters that had the capability to possess all three simultaneously. It was a deadly combination, and it was what made Headmaster Sleet such a powerful force to be reckoned with. "Let's go," I commanded the Baroker, and it took one giant step in front of the other as it slowly trudged its way to where Varleth and Aaron were. Immediately I noticed that Aaron's Staggy was gone, and that Varleth was the only one to go up against the Cyclops. Maybe she was out of mana? I had the elixir, but it was only half full now, so it would only give her a partial boost. I didn't think it would affect her any differently than it had me, and I felt fine, but I wasn't sure how it worked with mimics. As we marched closer, Varleth was thrown backward into a pile of what likely used to be additional storage for training equipment. Several splintered wood swords and shields stuck up and out around him, and I was mildly impressed that he hadn't been impaled on one of the jagged stakes. Aaron rushed to his side, but a streak of lightning cut through the sky like a hot knife through butter and struck beside her feet. She shrieked, and it rang out into the void as she fell to the ground in terror. I couldn't tell if she was all right, but she dug her elbows into the ground and crawled the remaining few feet to where Varleth was. The Cyclops approached them, and I shouted to divert its attention. Hopefully, it would buy them some time. "Hey, Ugly! This way!" I yelled, and at first, it didn't hear me. It continued to stomp its way to where they were vulnerable and more or less defenseless. With another thought, I commanded the Broker to lift its sword and smash it into the ground to try to draw the other monster away from my friends. The Baroker followed my command, and it drove the tip of its blade as far as it could into the surface, which was pretty cool, since the heavy sword cleaved a giant crevice in the earth that separated the Cyclops from Varleth and Aaron. Finally, we had the Cyclops' attention, and it was not happy. "Your fight is with me!" I called out to it, and its roar in response was so deep that it shook my body. Though that might have had something to do with the sound reverberating off the Baroker's iron armor. I wasn't a scientist, though. I could only speculate. The Cyclops eyed me and the Baroker, then turned to face us entirely. Now that I could see it in full, the Storm Cyclops had slightly different features and details than the standard variant. The giant was a deep shade of green, with bright yellow and white markings all over its fat body. There didn't seem to be a pattern or reason to the markings, much like the nature of lightning itself. Its singular eye was as gray as storm clouds, and it even had a cloudy look about it. It smacked its fat belly, and the clap sounded like thunder. The fat rippled like a drop of water on a still surface. It took a stance, and licked its chops with its long, girthy tongue. I cringed, but commanded my baroker to take a stance as well. It brought its sword up like a knight about to charge into battle, and then did just that. There wasn't time to wait for the Cyclops to make the first move. With a battle cry of my own, the baroker took a slow step forward, then thrust its sword at the monster. Somehow, the storm Cyclops managed to dodge my baroker's attack, and with a windy roar that echoed across the shadowscape, the Cyclops brought its bulbous hands up over its head and smashed them into the baroker's shoulders. I hastily hung on to one of my monster's iron horns to keep myself from an unpleasant tumble that likely would have led to my untimely demise. Even with how heavy-handed the Cyclops was, there was nary a trace of damage left on the baroker, not even a scratch to the already relatively scuffed armor. My baroker shook it off easily and brought its sword around for another swing. This time, it did connect. The blade tore a gash straight across the Cyclops' chest. Blackish-purple blood poured and bubbled from the open wound. The Cyclops' roar caused the clouds in the sky to gather. A cyclone spiraled over us, and bolts of lightning cracked through the thick gray funnel. The downpour that followed felt like needles against my skin, and it plinked off the baroker's armor. The Cyclops clutched its chest, and I held on to the baroker for dear life, as the wind threatened to knock me off. I searched for Varleth and Aaron, but saw neither of them as the storm raged above my head. All I could do was hope that they found some sort of shelter. When the Cyclops recovered from the initial blow, it ran its fingers through the blood that seeped out of the new gash on its chest, before bringing the blood to its lips and smearing it across its tongue. The taste of its own blood must have ignited something in it to fight back, because it reared its fist and landed a solid blow to the baroker's torso. We stumbled back, but the baroker planted its sword into the ground and gripped the hilt to keep us anchored. The Cyclops took a large step and punched us again, and then again. Each time a blow connected, I could feel the reverberations from the armor race up into my legs, and the motion made my stomach roil with nausea. I kept my cool, though, and I commanded the baroker to let go of the sword. When it did, it caught each of the Cyclops' bloody fists and pushed it back. My baroker kept pushing, and the Cyclops kept sliding through the rock and wreckage, until the back of its heel caught a large enough stone to trip it up, so that it landed on its back with a loud quake. Rain still pelted me in the face, as the baroker and I stood over the Cyclops, who struggled to get up. With moisture from the rain, it made the mix of dirt and stone slick and muddy, and the Cyclops' hand slipped as it attempted to roll onto its stomach. Instead, it flopped like a fish out of water, and floundered as we stood over it. Thunder crashed, and lightning crackled, as the baroker took its sword in hand again. Without a single thought of hesitation, we brought the sword up, and struck the Cyclops in the eye, then the stomach, and for good measure, through the newly added hole in its chest. As the storm broke apart, we noticed the sky cleared. The Cyclops laid lifeless before us, and my heart swelled with pride in knowing that my connection to the baroker was strong enough to take on a high-grade monster alone. Drenched and wind-blown, I continued the search for Varleth and Aaron. After a few moments, I saw Varleth drag Aaron out from behind a large pile of rocks that looked like it used to be a fountain in the courtyard. How it ended up all the way out on the other side of the campus was beyond me, but I supposed that was the nature of ruins. Things ended up where they didn't belong. "Varleth!" I called down, but there was no response. It was likely he wasn't able to hear me from all the way up here, so I commanded the baroker to set me down nearby, and I raced over to them. "Are you okay?" I yelled and skid to my knees. Aaron looked pale and out of breath, and Varleth had a deep cut on his neck that was likely to leave a nasty scar.
"We are now,"
Aaron replied with a weak smile.
"Sorry, we couldn't be of much help."
I shook my head. "Don't worry about it. I'm just glad you're both safe."
"What the hell happened?"
Varleth asked. "A rift opened up in the arena on top of the mock one," I replied with a grimace. "We were attacked by a pack of Chatteroshi, and I lost Gawain because he ran off to be a hero."
"Not sure that's really a loss."
Aaron rolled her eyes, and Varleth and I both snorted. "I didn't want him to get lost in here alone, so I went after him. I ended up finding the two of you instead." I finished my explanation. Aaron laughed, though it sounded pained.
"It's my fault we're in this situation. I was low on magic. Even though I recalled my staggy, I didn't have enough to fight back. But more than that, a pack of gastrotoads were in our way,"
Varleth finished for her.
"We took care of them, but Aaron got a full lungful of their gas."
I nodded with a frown. I had my own gastrotoad after all, so I knew how dangerous its gas could be. Worse yet, it was so insidious that it could seep through the standard-issued gas mask filters.
"I'll be okay, though,"
Aaron reassured me.
"I've got a tincture in my pouch that will give me a temporary boost of magic."
"Let's get you on your feet first." I laughed a little, impressed at her determination to keep up the fight. "Can you stand?" Aaron scooted her legs up and propped herself against a large rock. Her thin legs wobbled as she tried to balance herself, but even with the little bit of difficulty, she managed to stand on her own at first. After a moment, her legs gave out, and she crumpled into my arms. Her small breasts pressed against me, and her hands gripped my shoulders as she steadied herself. I smiled a little and pushed some hair from her face. "Think you might need more than a tincture to help in this case. Gastrotoad gas is nothing to sneeze at." A pretty blush crossed her cheeks, and she huffed. She knew I was right, though, but I had a feeling she was loath to admit it. She nodded, though, and I looked to Varleth. "Where's the catalyst?" I asked. I still held Aaron close.
"Not far from here,"
he responded, and pointed east.
"It's just past the other side of the arena, I think."
I considered my options. On the one hand, now that I knew Varleth and Aaron were relatively safe, I should go look for Gawain, but he had literally disappeared without a trace. How was I supposed to find him in here without the possibility of losing myself in the process? Prolonged exposure to the shadowscape was only one of the ways you could die on a monster response team. On the other, I didn't want to leave Aaron and Varleth to fend for themselves, especially when one half of their duo was unable to even stand on her own, much less defend her banisher while they continued their search of the catalyst. If we found the catalyst, then we could go home, and this would all be over. "Okay, Aaron, my Baroker's going to carry you, and we're going to find the catalyst and get you back so that we can fix you up," I declared, and she smiled at me softly.
"That's sweet of you, but I can do it myself,"
Aaron insisted, but when she tried to balance herself again, she immediately fell back into my chest.
"Damn it!"
"It's okay," I reiterated. "Take it easy." I led her over to the Baroker, who lowered his hand for me to lift her onto. I was surprised by how gentle the Iron Giant was with her as it cupped its hand and coddled her. Varleth waited for us a little further ahead and motioned for us to follow him once we were ready to go. I fell into step beside him as we climbed over the debris. "You think everyone on the outside is okay?" I asked. My companion shrugged.
"Who knows? We can only hope that once we destroy the catalyst, that the Academy is in one piece."
I hung my head. How does this keep happening? I thought the Xanyar Stone was supposed to prevent monster attacks from entering the enclaves. That's why we were safe in the first place. And now two of them have opened up within the walls, mere months from each other, Varleth noted.
"Something bigger is afoot here."
"You think it has something to do with the random mission Sleet sent us on?" I questioned.
"I honestly try not to question the things that the headmaster says," Varleth quipped. "He usually has a reason for everything, and he doesn't really take no for an answer anyway."
I laughed at that. You said it. We fell silent as we approached the catalyst stone, and it occurred to me that I'd never actually seen one up close before. I stared at it carefully, and studied everything I could about it. I don't know what I expected it to look like, but it was a literal stone etched with markings that resembled that of the gate, and was shrouded in black rime. It looked to be about the size of my hand. Varleth watched me as I examined the stone.
They vary in shape and size, but that's generally what they look like.
So you absorbed that into you? I asked, and Varleth nodded. Damn!
What? You thought it was easy?
Varleth teased with a smirk on his lips. Don't be like that, I laughed, and stepped aside to give him space to do what he did. He held out his hand over the stone, and his hand began to glow a soft white. That quickly changed, though, as he absorbed the rime into him, and the white soon turned to jet black. The veins on his arm bulged, and they too turned the same shade of black. In front of him, the stone started to crack, and from that crack, it splintered until it shattered, and the rime had been completely consumed. We stood still for a moment as Varleth caught his breath. Confusion wrought on his features. We were still inside the rift. Does it usually take this long? I asked slowly.
No, it's supposed to be instantaneous.
Varleth shook his head, and then looked at me with realization in his eyes.
We only destroyed the mock catalyst. The real one is still out there.
My eyes flew wide open. Excuse me?
You heard me,
he snapped, though I had a feeling it was more out of frustration with himself than with me. Something confirmed when he blew out a breath.
Sorry, Griff,
It's okay, I said with a grin. So then, where's the real one? Wouldn't you have been able to feel it? Varleth growled, then closed his eyes so that he could concentrate. After a moment, he opened them again.
It's faint, but it's toward the direction of the town,
he answered. That's out of the way, I said with a thoughtful frown. It could be anywhere in town.
It has to be close enough that I can feel it from here,
he reasoned. I crossed my arms and considered that. I still thought it was the best idea that I follow Varleth and keep him safe in Aaron's stead, especially because we didn't know where the gate was for this rift, or where Gawain had gone off to. I had to hope that when we destroyed the catalyst, he would be spit back out too. Thinking of Gawain reminded me that Aaron was also hurt. Aaron, you okay up there? I called up to her, but there was no response. I rolled my eyes and commanded my baroker, who had patiently followed us, to lower its hand so that I could see her. When I did, I gasped. Her face was paler than before, and a greenish cast had started to overtake her veins as the gastrotoad toxins seeped into her system. Her breathing was ragged, and there was a cold sheen of sweat on her brow. She isn't doing so well. I brushed some of the bright orange hair from her face and tucked it behind her ear. Don't worry, Aaron. We'll get you home soon. I turned back to Varleth, who simply frowned. All right, let's move then, I muttered. No sooner had the words left my mouth than did an awful sound tear through the sky. Varleth and I whipped our heads out in the direction of the ruins, and our mouths hung open. The gate that we had previously known to be the mock entrance rumbled, and through it came the third and final pyreworm that had escaped the rift in Harrow's gullet. We had already fought one, and the other had been used as a sacrifice to open a rift under Bothy Highlands weeks ago. This one, though, was very much alive. Its serpentine body and worm-like head wiggled as it re-entered, like it was glad to be home after a month and a half of long vacation. Pyreworms had no eyes and no mouth, but the sound they emitted was enough to be fatal to those who heard it, and neither of us had our earmuffs. They were made of bandersnatch skin and marmon tusks, and were specifically designed for fighting against them. This isn't happening! I stared in disbelief, and then I closed my eyes, refocused myself, and opened them once more. Find the catalyst, Varleth. I'll see you on the other side. I swallowed thickly, before I ran back to my baroker and climbed into its hand beside Erin. I didn't want to take her with me with the poison still playing havoc with her system, but leaving her with Varleth didn't seem like the best decision either. She would slow him down, and the quicker we got out of here, the better off we would be. To leave her alone was out of the question.
I can help,
she rasped, and I shook my head. You need to rest, I insisted, and I brushed my hand over her cheek. Erin groaned weakly. I had to hide her someplace safe until we could get her properly treated.
Wait!
The banisher yelled.
What about you?
I'm going to distract it. Don't worry about me, I replied with a smirk. I reached my hand out, and Varleth met it with a fist bump. Good luck, he wished, and he ran off past the wall of the academy and began his search through the town to find the catalyst stone. As for me, I was headed back to what would likely be my hardest and most challenging fight to date. Chapter 16. We left Varleth, and the baroker carried us back to the ruins of the arena, where the pyreworm lurked. I cradled Erin's head in my lap and ran my fingers through her hair, as I mentally prepared myself for this fight. Truth be told, I was nervous. I was completely unequipped to fight a pyreworm on my own, but it had gotten out of the rift once before. Who was to say it wasn't capable of doing it again? I needed to make sure that it wasn't able to re-enter the real world and cause any more havoc. The only way to do that was to see its demise once and for all. I didn't have the earmuffs, so that would be a problem. I thought of maybe using one of my monsters to block out the sound, which might work if I can figure out a way to execute it right. And the only monster I had that could fly was the Kalgori, and though it might be able to put up a good fight, I didn't see that as being an effective tactic. And as I tried to figure out what to do, I got an idea. I only hoped that I'd be able to pull it off. The closer we got as we approached the pyreworm, the more anxiously I went over ideas and ticked off my supplies in my head. I still had the reserve of elixir, even if it was only half. I thought about giving it to Erin, but I wasn't a healer. I didn't want to take the risk of giving her something and having it react badly to the poison in her body. On the one hand, it might clear it up, and she'd be fighting fit, but on the other, the results were grim, and I wasn't willing to take that chance. I had all my crystals too, though the majority of them were no match for the Grade A monster that awaited us. Then, my 2 daggers. They might come in handy if I had to take the pyreworm down by my own hand, which I was willing to do if it meant it would ensure the safety of the other side. I took a deep breath. Erin's breath was too shallow and harsh. I scouted for a place that I could let her rest while I took care of the pyreworm. We were almost there, and there wasn't anywhere that wasn't entirely out of harm's way. That was when I saw something perched against the side of a broken wall. From up here, it looked like a red and white blemish in the dirt, but upon closer inspection, that something was not just anything. In fact, it wasn't a thing at all. It was a person. The person I had been looking for. "Gawain!" I shouted, and he might have tilted his head back to look up, but it was hard to tell. Either way, he hadn't made any visible sign of movement, and that was not good. There was no way that the pyreworm hadn't seen my baroker, but it seemed to wait patiently, as though it knew that we were going to come for it one way or another. We stopped a few yards from Gawain, and the baroker lowered us to the ground. I leapt out of the palm of its hand, and gasped when I saw Gawain's state. He was pale, like he'd lost a lot of blood, and while I could see blood on him, it didn't look like it had been enough to cause his state to be so ragged. I ran to him and knelt beside him. His eyes were unfocused, but he was still conscious. "I should have listened to you," he breathed, and he slumped forward a little. It was then that I'd caught the extent of his wounds. On his back were 2 symmetrical holes, on either side of his spine, just big enough to look like a little girl somehow punched through his skin with their bare hands. His cloak was tattered, almost shredded to nothing, and the back of his uniform was completely saturated in his own blood. The rock behind him was stained with it as well. Well, shit! I ran my hands over my face, which in hindsight was a bad idea, as I wiped Gawain's blood down my cheeks, but I couldn't find it in me to care. What the hell happened to you? I tried not to sound completely horrified, despite being exactly that. I'm not sure, he admitted after a moment. I was chasing the little girl, and the next thing I knew, I was completely in a different place. Far different from anything I'd seen. It was cold, and completely overrun with high-grade monsters. Gawain coughed and groaned in pain as he slumped back against the stone with a slight wince. I couldn't really see where I was, but I followed the sound of her voice, and she led me somewhere. The next thing I knew, she was whispering directly into my ear, though I could see her standing several feet away from me. Gawain shivered, and I fished the rest of the elixir out of my pouch. It wouldn't be enough to heal him fully, but it would close the wounds on his back and stop the bleeding, and poured the liquid between his slightly parted and cracked lips. A bit of it trickled down his chin, but he swallowed most of it. After a moment, some of the color started to return to his face, and he took a few steadier breaths, then continued his story. I couldn't understand her. It was a language I hadn't heard before. I felt a sharp pain in my back. And then I woke up here. I wanted to prove myself, and all I ended up doing was making a fool of myself again, he finished. But even as he started to look better, the look of defeat on his face was prominent. I shook my head. You thought you were doing the right thing, Gawain. Yes, well, look where it got me, he replied, and finally looked me in the eyes. What about you? What happened after I left? I went looking for you. I laughed a little. Then got lost, fought a Cyclops, and then Varlith tried to destroy the catalyst, but it was the one from the Magicynito. The real one is somewhere in the town. Shit. This just gets worse and worse, Gawain swore, and shook his head. The girl? Oh, Erin? I pointed to the Baroker, who put its hand out. It was hard to see from here, but if nothing else, it was obvious that she wasn't well. Gastritode gas attack. She got a good whiff, I think, so she might be down for a while. Gawain frowned, and I don't think I'd ever seen him look so genuinely sad. She's going to be okay, though, right? I nodded despite being a bit unsure myself. Yeah, she will, but I need to get her somewhere safe so that I can fight that pyre worm. Gawain twisted his features. Pyre worm? You know, the giant flying dragon worm that's about 100 yards away, and probably wants to absorb your soul for breakfast? I rolled my eyes as I teased him. Piss off, he snorted, then weakly climbed to his feet. It took him a few moments to get his bearings, but once he did, he looked 1,000 times better than he had before. I'm ready, he said, and ignited the balls of flames in his hands. As soon as they appeared, however, they began to flicker out. What? Your mana is too low to maintain a flame, I noted. Immediately Gawain whipped his gun out and tried to pump his mana through. Sure enough, it lit up once, but then nothing. He swore under his breath. You're not fighting this one, Gawain, I told him earnestly. Leave it to me. Gawain looked me up and down. I'm sure I looked a mess myself, but I was more fit to fight this thing than any of the three of us. Listen, I continued. I need you to take Erin as far away as you can. I don't want either of you to get caught up in this. How many times do I have to tell you that I don't take orders from yokels? He barked, eyes furious for a brief moment, and then he softened again. Fine, but you'd better come back for us. I stood with a hand on my hip and smirked, as I gave him a victory pose. Of course I will. Gawain rolled his eyes so hard that I thought he might have hurt himself, with a groan that followed. Just give me the stupid girl. We walked back over to Erin, who was still half unconscious and curled up in the palm of the Baroker's hand. I placed my hand on her forehead. She was still burning hot to the touch. With a deep-set frown, I picked her up and handed her gently to Gawain, who handled her with a surprisingly delicate hand. "She looks worse up close," he commented as he lifted her up in his arms, and at first I thought I saw a sneer on his lips, but it quickly melted to clear concern on his face. "Let's hope Varlith finds the catalyst soon," I sighed. "Until then, keep her safe until I get back." "Hey," he said as he spun back to look at me. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said. "Get out of here. Come back alive. All right?" He looked away from me so that I didn't see his face. "What? You want to get a beer afterward or something?" I tried to laugh, but it came out dry and hollow. "I still want to beat you," he sighed. "So don't let that flying worm kill you, or I'll be pissed." "Don't let anything happen to Erin," I said. Gawain nodded, and despite his still weak legs, he managed to carry her away at a decently paced jog. I watched them leave for a moment, before I turned my attention to the pyreworm. It still circled further ahead, and even though it had no eyes, I felt like it could see me peering at it with each pass in my direction. It was unnerving. I gathered my gumption and took a deep breath as I climbed back atop my Baroker. I took my place atop its helmet and gave it the command. "Let's go." The Baroker marched. It was slow, and as we edged closer and closer, the anticipation of the battle crept up my spine. I took out my bullet bass crystal and smashed it between my hands over my head. I was engulfed in light, and when it dissipated, I was clad with my own skin made of metal. I was no Orin with his metal log abilities, but hopefully this would help. At the very least, I hoped it would block the awful cries that pyreworms had a tendency to unleash. I felt my mana slip a little, but it was nothing dangerous. It would take minimal concentration to keep the armor on, but I had enough experience splitting my mind between two monsters that I could handle it. The real challenge was going to be splitting it between a third. The speed slug didn't take much mana, nor did it take a lot of concentration. But I was still a little nervous to divide my mana and my attention so thin. I took the crystal between my fingers and threw it down onto the Baroker. This was it. As soon as the speed slug fastened itself to the back of the Baroker's neck, we took off at a high-speed sprint, and closed the distance between us and the pyreworm in mere moments. With my own loud battle cry, the Baroker heaved its giant sword off the ground and dragged the tips across the dirt and debris. It made a sharp slicing sound as it came up and whooshed through the air, but the pyreworm, being a primarily aerial fighter, easily dodged the attack, despite the speed slug's boost, with one massive flap of its wings. I gritted my teeth as the Baroker tried again. This time it clipped the tip of its foot, but if the pyreworm howled out in pain, I didn't hear it. My plan had worked. The Baroker had massive reach, and was immensely strong, but so very slow. Combined with the speed slug, it had a chance to use that size and might to full effect. The Baroker brought the blade up for the third time, but by then, the pyreworm was already learning my tricks. It rocketed upwards, then shot down at us at an angle. It never actually collided with us, but the sheer force from the wind that buffeted off its wings were almost as strong as the gust from the Cyclops storm from before. Fortunately, I was fast enough to latch on tight to the iron horn next to me. I kept my footing, and when it came down a second time, I was ready. The pyreworm swooped down again, this time from behind. Maybe it thought it would catch me off guard, but not today. I played along though, confident in the boosted speed of my Baroker, and at the last second, I mentally commanded the Baroker to use that speed to spin, and quickly thrust its sword upwards. The pyreworm fumbled as it tried to spiral against the thrust, but it was too slow. The massive sword connected with its left wing, spearing through the meat of it with a burst of blood, and the pyreworm spiraled to the ground. Still, it managed to land on both feet in spite of its injury. We didn't give it time to recover, though, and we charged at it with as much speed as we could, sword in front, and full ready to take advantage of the pyreworm's now injured wing. The pyreworm, however, had other plans. While its left wing was too damaged to allow it to fly, it was still able to produce the rine that emanated from the glands on its wings. It turned to face us, and suddenly we were encompassed in a cloud of the corrupted essence. The bullet bass armor couldn't stand up against it, and it crumbled to pieces as it fell from my body. Instantaneously, my ears began to ring, and my head began to pound as the cry of the pyreworm pierced my ears, and I screamed in agony as I covered them and fell to my knees. I scrunched my eyes shut as though it would help block out the sound, even though I knew that to be completely false. When I did crack my eye open, I noted that my speed slug had begun to shrivel from the onslaught, and I could feel the Baroker grow more and more sluggish, though I thought that maybe that was more from the effects of the rine than the weakening speed slug. I withdrew both the slug and the bullet bass before they could sustain any more damage. I was thankful for the mask on my face, but with the high concentration of rine that I was being bombarded with, I didn't actually know if it was helping anymore. My chest hurt, and everything felt a little bleaker than it had when I'd first entered this fight. I thought briefly that maybe I should have come up with a plan B. It might have been a smart move. Who doesn't go into battle like this without a plan B? I did, apparently, and now I had to think of a way to come back from this. As the pain in my head overcame me, I lost balance and slid from the top of the Baroker's helmet, and the rush of air made my cloak flutter around me as I made my descent to the ground. I was powerless to stop myself, and 40-something feet was a long way down. The blood trickled down the side of my face from my ears, and everything, even the black rine, began to have a fuzzy sort of glow to it. The next time I opened my eyes was to see my Baroker standing guard over me, sword in hand, as it shielded me from an onslaught of furious claw and wing attacks from the pyreworm. One after another, the iron clanged and echoed across the shadowscape as the worm battered my faithful monster. I sat up painfully, and as I took in the sight of my Baroker, I noticed two things. The first was that its armor was scratched and dinged in places that it wasn't before, and I wondered if it had taken all that damage from me while I was knocked out. The second was that its flames were no longer red and orange. Instead, they had a pinkish hue to them, and they seemed to burn brighter and hotter. I wondered if that was an effect brought on by the rine. My dagger seared at my hip, and I clutched the hilt and brought it in front of me. To my surprise, it also glowed pink, instead of what seemed to be its usual bluish color. And it dawned on me that there had to be a connection, a bond between myself and my Baroker. I stood on my feet, shocked to find that I was still in one piece, and approached my Baroker. 1 foot in front of the other, I marched, dagger in hand, back into battle. I came to a stop between the Baroker's legs, and took a stance. I probably seemed small and puny to anyone who might have been an onlooker. Not that there were any, but I felt stronger than I ever had before. I yelled, and the sound seemed to disappear into the void that was the shadowscape as I brought my dagger up, let my mana flow into it, and unleashed all that energy into another powerful shockwave. The blast was even more intense than the last time I had used the blade, powerful enough to knock my guardian Baroker's sword aside as it smashed into the pyreworm's chest. I took several more steps forward, sucked in a deep breath, and did it again, and then again. With each piercing wave of pure light, the pyreworm looked more and more drained of energy, as if the dagger's power was somehow disintegrating the corrupted rine inside of it. My Baroker followed behind me, and took this moment of opportunity to swing at the pyreworm with all its might. The flat edge of the sword connected with the worm's head, and it sailed into a pile of ruins, crashed through stones, tumbled, flailed, then skidded to a dead stop. I scrambled back into the Baroker's hand, and it carried me away to where the pyreworm lay. All the while, I only hoped that Gawain and Aaron had made it out of the ruins. When my baroker set me down again, I was face to face with the very creature that had brought so much destruction to the real world. The pyreworm was a sucker of souls, if my memory served me right. I was glad that no one had to suffer that fate, and now this one would never get the chance to. My baroker and I lifted our weapons over the battered and broken monstrosity at the same time. As the baroker brought its giant sword down into the pyreworm's chest, I thrust my dagger into its skull. Rhyme seeped out of it, but the sound of its hiss as its life was taken away was infinitely more bearable than its normal cry, and much sweeter to my ears. Still in total harmony, we both removed our weapons. My dagger returned to its normal state, and the fire that surrounded the baroker returned to the orange and red it was supposed to be. "We did it," I uttered to the baroker, and though I might have imagined it, I would have sworn I saw it nod in response. "Let's get back to the others." My giant lifted me up again, and I smiled as we set out to find Gawain and Aaron. I'd gotten used to traversing the shadowscape in much bigger steps. They weren't far, at least by the standards of the baroker's big metal steps. The two of them were huddled in what looked to be the remnants of the girls' dormitories. I was impressed that Gawain had made it that far while carrying Aaron. That wasn't an easy trek. Gawain looked up at me as we approached. He looked drained, and there were several more cuts on him than there was when I'd left them. "You made it," he smirked, as the baroker set me down in front of them. "So did you." I turned to the baroker and held up my hand. "I couldn't have done it without your help." The baroker very gently touched its hand to mine, in a fashion that I could only describe as the gentlest of high fives, and I found myself amazed that such a brutal monster could be so kind to humans. It was oddly endearing. It retreated back into its crystal, and I turned back to Gawain and Aaron. "How is she?" I asked, and knelt beside her. She was calm, and her skin was cool and clammy. Her fever must have broken, and the poison was slowly working its way out of her system. "She's been asleep the whole time," Gawain answered. "We ran into some imps on the way here. Nothing that I couldn't handle on my own. But she didn't make a peep." I caught a glimpse of a smile on his lips, and I chuckled. I wasn't going to point it out and start an argument over whether or not he could in the first place. I'd save it for another time when it would be more embarrassing to bring it up. The shadowscape gave a familiar rumble, and I perked up. The rift was closing. Varleth made it, just like I knew he would. The now familiar tingle of having the shadowscape ripped out from around me ran through my body, and suddenly we were back in the real world. As it turned out, we really were right outside of the girls' dorms, and it looked like it was the middle of the night. Everything, thankfully, seemed to be in pristine condition, which meant that if any of the monsters made it out of the rift, they didn't make it this far. Good.
"Griff? Is that you?"
A voice I recognized sounded from my right, and Gawain and I looked to see Arwen racing toward us.
Miss Hamner,"
I stuttered, and caught myself before I could be inappropriate. She hushed me and touched my cheeks, then checked Gawain. When she finally saw Aaron, she gasped.
"Oh no. She needs attention now,"
she said frantically.
"What happened to her?"
"She ran out of my magic, and we got separated," I started. "Then she got exposed to gastrotoad toxins." Arwen held up her hand and cradled Aaron against her. Her eyes went wide, and she searched the area around us.
"Varleth,"
she trailed off, and based on the expression and color draining from her face, I could tell that she had assumed the worst. "Is in the city somewhere," I finished for her. "Safe and sound, I bet," as he closed the rift. She nodded as relief washed over her face, and then looked over Gawain and me again. "If you can walk, follow me," Arwen told us. "If not, I'll send someone to fetch you." With that, she whisked Aaron away to get treatment. I looked to Gawain, who nodded, and I helped him onto his feet. He was a little wobbly, but he managed okay. I had started to walk away when he called out to me. "You dropped this!" When I turned, I saw him holding a grayish crystal with a green hue to it. It was shaped like a small wing. "That isn't one of mine," I said slowly, but I took it from him anyway. As soon as it touched the palm of my hand, I nearly dropped it again. "Holy shit!" "What?" he asked, mildly curious. "It's the essence crystal for the pyre worm." I laughed a little and turned it over in my hands. I couldn't believe I had the chance to control a monster as wicked as a pyre worm. I started to walk off again, and again, Gawain called out to me, only this time, he fell into step beside me. It was weird to walk alongside him as a peer, and not want to throttle him completely. "Hey, Griff," he started, and I was shocked at the use of my real name. I looked to him fully, and he brought his eyes up to meet mine. "Thanks for coming for me," he said, and I smiled. "Any time, Gawain," I laughed. "Besides, don't we have a duel to fight someday?" "That we do," he said, and the man's lips curved up into a sincere smile. Chapter 17. How much time passed while we were in the shadowscape? I asked Arwen, as she tended to me in the infirmary, even after I insisted I was fine. I probably wasn't, but the high from coming off an epic battle had convinced me that I was. "About 2 days," she answered me softly as she ran her fingers through my hair. Her healing light washed over me, and I instantly felt loads better. I laid back quietly and shut my eyes. "Feels nice." I could sense the smile in Arwen's tone as she responded. "Good. You should get some rest." "Wait. What happened to the rest of my team?" I cracked an eye open and saw that she sat at the edge of the bed. I did see Arwen smile then, and she put a hand on my chest to ease me back into the pillows again. "Headmaster Slate sent someone to fetch Varleth from the town proper," Arwen told me. "Gawain will need a few days to recover from his injuries, but he will heal nicely, despite some scarring. As for Erin, she too will be all right, though it's going to take a bit of time for her to recover." Arwen pressed her lips. "Gastrotoad gas is quite dangerous, as you well know, but you managed to get her out of the rift before she was too far gone. She'll have to undergo treatments for a time until we can be certain that all the poison has left her body. She is expected to make a full recovery, though, assuming that there isn't any lasting damage." I frowned at that last bit, but I was glad to know that Erin was alive. She'd really given it her all out there. I was proud of her. "Now..."
Richard put tension to the rope to let Samuel know who was in charge, then put away the sword. "Here, you carry the pretty lady's pack." Samuel snatched the pack out of Richard's hands. "Mine! Gimme!" Big hands started rummaging through it. Richard gave a sharp tug on the rope. "That doesn't belong to you. Keep your hands out of it." Bulging yellow eyes, filled with hate, looked up at him. "When Mistress kills you, then Samuel eats you." "If I don't eat you first," Richard sneered. "I'm pretty hungry. Maybe I'll have a little Samuel stew along the way." The look of hate changed to a look of wide, yellow-eyed terror. "Please, no kill me. Samuel take you to Mistress, to pretty lady, promise." He put the pack to his shoulder and took a few steps until he ran out of slack. "Follow Samuel, hurry," he said, wanting to prove his worth alive. "No cook Samuel, please," he muttered over and over, as they went back down the trail. Richard couldn't begin to imagine what sort of creature Samuel was. There was something familiar, unsettling about him. He wasn't very tall, but he was powerfully strong. Richard's jaw still throbbed from where Samuel had hit him, and his neck and head ached from having his head pounded on the ground. Long arms nearly reached the ground as Samuel walked along in an odd waddle, muttering over and over that he didn't want to be cooked. Short, dark pants held up with straps were all he wore. His feet were as disproportionately large as his hands and arms. His belly was round and full with what, Richard could only wonder. There was no hair on him anywhere, and his skin looked as if it hadn't been in the sunlight in years. From time to time, Samuel would snatch up a stick or a rock and say, "Mine! Gimme!" to no one in particular, only to soon lose interest and drop his latest find. Keeping a sharp eye on both the woods and Samuel, Richard followed the companion, prodding him to move faster. He was afraid for Kalin, and he was furious at himself. Old John, or the Calthrop, or whatever it was, had completely taken him in. He couldn't believe how stupid he had been. He had fallen for the story because he had wanted to believe, had wanted so badly to see Zed. The very thing he had always told others not to do. And there he was, giving the monster the information it then repeated back to him as proof. He was furious at how stupid he had been. He was also painfully ashamed. People believe things because they want to, he had told Kalin, and so had he. And now the witch woman had her. The very thing she had been so afraid of, and because he had been so stupid, had let his guard down. It seemed that every time he let his guard down, she was the one who paid the price. If the witch woman harmed Kalin, she would find out what the wrath of a seeker was all about, he vowed to himself. Once again he reprimanded himself. He was letting his imagination get away from him. If Shota wanted to kill her, she would have done so on the spot. She wouldn't be taking her back to Agaden Reach. But why take her back to the Reach? Unless, as Samuel put it, she wanted to play with her. Richard tried to put that thought out of his mind. It had to be him she wanted, not Kalin. That was probably why the Calthrop left so quickly. The witch woman had scared it off. When they reached the fork they had passed before, Samuel took them immediately down the left path. It was getting dark, but the companion didn't slow. The trail started climbing up steep switchbacks, and soon they were out of the trees onto an open trail across the rock, climbing steadily toward the jagged, snow-covered peaks. In the moonlit snow, Richard could see two sets of footprints, one of them Kalin's. A good sign, he thought. She was still alive. It didn't look like Shota intended to kill her, at least not right away. Skirting the bottom of the snowcaps, the path led over the bottom fringes of the snow, which was wet, heavy, and hard to walk through. Without Samuel leading the way, knowing where this pass was, Richard realized it would take days to make it over these peaks. The cold wind whipped through the gaps in the rock, pulling away long, thin clouds of their breath in the frigid air. Samuel was shivering. Richard put on his cloak, then pulled Kalin's out of the pack Samuel was carrying. "This belongs to the pretty lady. You may wear it for now to keep warm." Samuel snatched the cloak out of his hands. "Mine! Gimme!" "If you're going to be like that, then I won't let you wear it." Richard pulled the rope taut and yanked the cloak back. "Please, Samuel Cold," he whined. "Please, wear the pretty lady's cloak." Richard handed it back. This time the companion took it slowly and put it around his shoulders. The little creature made Richard's skin crawl. He took out a piece of tava bread and ate it as they walked along. Samuel kept looking over his shoulder, watching Richard eat. When he could stand it no longer, Richard offered Samuel a piece. The big hands reached out. "Mine! Gimme!" Richard pulled the bread back out of reach. Pleading yellow eyes looked up at him in the moonlight. "Please." Richard carefully put the bread into his eager hands. Samuel made small talk as they trudged through the snow. He had eaten the bread in one bite. Richard knew if given the chance, Samuel would slit his throat without a second thought. He seemed to be a creature devoid of any redeeming qualities. "Samuel, why does Shota keep you around?" He looked back over his shoulder, his yellow eyes set in a puzzled frown. "Samuel, companion." "And won't your mistress be angry with you for leading me to her?" Samuel made a gurgling sound that Richard took for laughter. "Mistress not afraid of seeker." Near dawn, at the edge of a descent into a dark wood, Samuel's long arm pointed downward. "Agaden reach," he gurgled. He looked back over his shoulder with a taunting grin. "Mistress." The heat was oppressive in the wood. Richard took off his cloak and put it in his pack, then stuffed Caitlin's back in hers. Samuel watched without protest. He seemed happy, confident to be back in the reach. Richard pretended he could see where they were going, not wanting to give the companion any idea that he was almost blind in the thick darkness. Richard let himself be guided along by the rope like a blind man. Samuel loped along as if it were bright as midday. Whenever he turned his hairless head back to Richard, his yellow eyes shone like twin lanterns. As the light of dawn slowly suffused the wood, Richard could begin to see large trees all about, trailers of moss wafting down, boggy patches with vapor rising from the black murky water, pairs of eyes that watched and blinked from the shadows. Hollow calls echoed through the mist and vapor as he stepped carefully over the tangle of roots. The place reminded him a little of the Scow Swamp. It smelled just as rank. "How much farther?" "Close," Samuel grinned. Richard took up the slack on the rope. "Just remember, if anything goes wrong, you die first." The grin faded from the bloodless lips. Here and there in the mud, Richard could see the same pair of footprints that he had seen in the snow. Caitlin was still walking. Dark forms followed, keeping to the shadows, the thick brush, sometimes letting out whoops and howls. Richard wondered and worried if they were more things like Samuel, or worse. Some followed in the treetops just beyond sight. Despite his best efforts to halt it, a shiver went up his spine. Samuel skirted off the path around the twisted roots of a squat, fat-trunked tree. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, pulling the companion to a halt. Samuel grinned back at him. "Watch!" He picked up a stout stick, big as his wrist, and threw it with an
other study. Word would soon reach Lord Mowbray, who fostered the twins, that the castle had been seized and her father, Lord Seagrave, had been murdered. He would keep her brothers safe, and possibly even raise an army, but she doubted the latter. Mowbray was more likely to wait out the besiegers. If a few of her father's men had been able to escape, they might make their way to Mowbray to try and convince him. But from what Cora had witnessed, the 200 soldiers her father possessed had fought to the death. Those who weren't dead yet would be soon. There really was no hope save for the lad with her missive. Cora curled up in a ball on the floor, tucking one of the blankets around her. How drastically her life had changed, and so quickly, in a few moments. It was probably too much to hope that the one person who'd been able to save her before when they were besieged would rescue her once more. She should leave, save herself. She knew that was what her mother would want her to do. Why else shout about Cora having been married off? But Cora couldn't. Not when her mother languished in the dank dark, rats feasting on her toes. Not when her mother had suffered in order to save Cora. If nothing else, she had to at least try to save her mother, for her brothers' sakes. Cora rubbed at her arms, trying to soothe away her fear, but it did no good. What was it she had often heard her mother say? Something about without fear one is reckless, and when one is reckless, everyone gets hurt. She had never really understood quite what her mother meant by that, but she thought it had something to do with making a plan. Well, her plan was foolhardy with plenty of room for disaster, but she had enough fear that maybe, just maybe, they'd be able to walk away from this. Chapter 2. The atmosphere around them changed as they inched ever closer to the border. It wasn't simply that the Highland air had long since disappeared, or that the colourful fields of purple thistle turned to trampled soggy weeds. There was something about the way the villagers reacted when they passed. The way the earth moved beneath their horses' hooves. The sense of danger, Liam hated it. He was a Highlander through and through. Every bone and fibre in his body reached behind him, longing to make the trek back over the Grampian Mountains towards Sutherland lands and Dunrobin Castle. He used that longing to fuel them all forward. The quicker they obtained Ughtred, the better, and perhaps their path would cross by an abbey where he'd once left something precious to him that he dearly wanted. Their scouts returned with news they'd either caught wind of Ughtred themselves or overheard others speak of him. It seemed Ina's henchman husband left quite a wake behind him. They followed the clues until they reached a small village on the opposite side of the Scottish border on English lands. Liam and his men changed into their trews and shirts so that they could pass for English if they remained silent, save for Liam, who had mastered the art of an English accent from his mother and his Uncle Blaine. Liam exited the tavern where they'd stopped to ask a few subtle questions, and to buy several sacks of oats for the horses, who'd worked hard to get them to the border a day earlier than expected. The tavern owner offered him use of the stables for the horses, but Liam sensed there was something else going on. Either the man suspected Liam wasn't who he said he was, and was keen on turning them over to the English, or the man wanted to steal their horses. Either way, Liam didn't trust him, and as such, he nodded to Tad to give the men the order to ride. They'd not be staying the night. Though Ughtred had married a Scot, he'd married one whose clan had sided with the English, a traitor to their own country. Ina might have Scottish blood running through her veins, but she was every bit a Sassenach in Liam's mind. In fact, Ughtred was not her first English husband. She seemed to have an affinity for the limp rags. They rode slowly through the village square, down the road and through the rickety gate attached to an even ricketier wooden fence that would serve no purpose in keeping the enemy out, though it would give the villagers a few moments to hide or gather their weapons. Given they were so close to the border, it was unclear why the villagers hadn't gone to more lengths to protect themselves. Well, it wasn't any of his concern. Besides, the backward English were constantly making decisions he didn't agree with or understand, and it often seemed they were tempting death. When the last of his men had cleared the gate, Liam ordered his horse into a trot, keen on getting them as far away from the village as he could. He couldn't pinpoint what it was, but something didn't feel right. Alert and half expecting a horde of English mercenaries armed only with pitchforks and clubs rushing through the gates after them, he caught sight of a single rider in the moonlight barreling down the road. Though it was dark, the closer he came, he could make out that the figure was on the smaller side. What the devil? Liam picked up speed, his intention no longer on the line of his men, but on the rider in front of him. No one rode like that unless they were running from the devil, or they were the devil themselves. Either way, Liam was ready to meet him head-on. The men followed, forming a line, giving the rider nowhere else to go but through them, which would only result in him getting unhorsed, as the men held up their pikes, prepared to knock him off. "Halt!" Liam demanded, surprised to see the rider was no more than a dirt-covered lad. Muck smeared his skin, and the stench of him came before his body. Liam gagged, as did several of his men. The lad proved to be a reckless one and tried to rush right through their line, but Liam was faster. He grabbed hold of the lad's collar as his horse passed, and lifted him clear off his mount. Tad caught the horse's reins, while Liam held the boy aloft, beside him, the lad's legs kicking like a marionette. "Did you not hear me, lad? I bade you stop." Liam continued to use his English accent, uncertain yet what to do with the lad, and not wanting to leave any trace of his Scottish roots behind in this treacherous place. "Let me go!" The lad's voice was strong, not only for his age, but for one hanging in mid-air. "I'd be happy to grant your request, as soon as you tell me why you were riding so recklessly. You could have killed yourself and made your horse lame." "I owe you no answer, sir." The lad's voice dripped insolence, but also fear. Liam couldn't help but think he was brave for speaking up. "You've bollocks of iron, I'll grant you that. But it will not help you in this situation. What is your aim, lad? I am on a mission. He wriggled more violently now, swinging his arms in an effort to punch Liam without success. Ah, so am I. Do tell, what is your mission? Liam kept his voice jovial, as though he weren't dangling the lad above the ground. The lad locked eyes with Liam for the first time, and he frowned, as though trying to hide his confusion. He looked like he was assessing Liam very much the same way Liam was measuring him. Smart little bugger. Again, Liam was impressed. He thought all the English were bred to be whelps. Clearly that flaw had bypassed this one. Well, Liam encouraged, I'll not be letting you go. Best get on with telling me what I want to know. I'm on a mission for my mistress, and if you do not let me go, 'twill be a matter of her death. Her death? Liam scowled. She may be dead already. The lad shuddered. Liam frowned. Why, is she very old? Ill? Where were you going? The lad pressed his lips into a firm line, and when Liam shook him, he said only, I do not have permission to give you that information. You make a good messenger. Loyal, I admire that, Liam said. The lad's eyes shifted toward his horse, perhaps hoping that Liam would let him go in light of this observation. Wishful thinking. Did he take Liam for a fool? Well, he supposed if the lad believed him to be English, he might think that very same thing. Have you ever heard the phrase, do not kill the messenger? Liam asked. Aye. Frightened eyes met his. Why do you think that is? Liam flicked his gaze back toward the village, quiet and dark as when they'd arrived. The lad screwed up his face in confusion. That I've heard it, or that it exists? Liam shrugged a shoulder. Indulge me with answers to both. The lad wiggled his legs in a faint effort to escape. This is a waste of time, sir. I need to go. My mistress— Answer me, Liam growled. If she dies, 'twill be on your head. Liam bared his teeth, and the lad yelped. I've heard it said because everyone has, the lad said, and it is said as a reminder to men not to kill those who would only deliver the message. Liam grinned. Aye. So you will not kill me? Relief flooded the lad's features. Nay, of course not. But I won't let you go either, until you tell me your message. He tensed up again. All the fear and uncertainty drained from his young face and was replaced by anger. I've told you already. You're simply not listening. It is just that. The lady's death is upon her, and she seeks— someone. The lad was speaking in riddles. Who is the lady, and who does she seek? I cannot tell you. The lad fidgeted with his sleeve. Liam barely made out the shape of a rolled scroll beneath the fabric. Give it to me. What? The lad sputtered, realizing too late his mistake and what he'd revealed. Before he could argue more, Liam wrapped a large arm around the lad's body and used his other hand to pull out the parchment. All the while the lad spewed such insults Liam was certain he must have learned the words from a gang of outlaws. He tossed the lad to Tad, who held him in a tight bear hug, while Liam unrolled the parchment that bore no wax. Had the writer been in a hurry? Ink smudged the parchment that had been torn raggedly from its original piece. Dear Saviour, dear Sir, dear Liam, not a day has gone by in all these years that I have not thought of you, nor forgotten how very much I owe you, including my life. But alas, the time has come where I must beg of your help once more. I am besieged. My father is dead, my mother imprisoned. Come soon, for I fear my death. C. The blood left Liam's face, and he wavered slightly on his horse. The mount shifted, making up for the swaying of its rider. The name, Liam, was it a coincidence? The contents of the letter contained truths of his past, and the initial at the end suggested this could be a letter from the lass he'd saved nearly half his life ago. But the odds of the parchment being for him were daunting. His Cora was safely tucked away at an abbey, or so he thought. He cleared his throat and then asked the lad who his mistress was, while he reread the torn and used parchment with hasty curves showing a trembling hand. "Please dinna be her—" "Oh, never tell!" the lad shouted, tears gathering in his eyes. "Listen, lad, you're loyal, I know it." Liam realized too late his natural brogue had returned. "I must know who she is." "You're Scots! You'll kill her! Kill me instead!" the lad shouted. Tad slapped his hand over the lad's mouth at the same time Liam growled, reached with lightning speed to take the lad by the collar, and drew him close. "This letter was addressed with my name. Tell me who she is, or I swear on your mother's blood I will murder ye right here and feed your bones to the dogs." The lad's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again. "Lady Cora." Liam shoved the lad away and let an expletive fly from his lips. Cora. By all the saints. He'd not seen nor heard from her in all these years, but he'd thought of her often enough, had stalked near to where he'd left her safely hidden away. Too much of a coward to claim her outright. Wondered if she ever thought of him. Not that he expected her to. What they'd done in the kirk 13 years prior had been for her safety and a secret before God and the priest who'd helped them. Not for anyone else to know. And after all this time that had passed with them apart, why had she not married another? Married. Liam rolled up the parchment and stuck it up his own sleeve. This presented a complication he never could have foreseen. An ambush on the road, a villager calling them out to English troops, a late spring snowstorm that kept them huddled in shelter for a day or two. Even an attack from wolves could have been more expected than this. But Cora, he remembered how she'd looked back then. So beautiful to his adolescent eyes. Hair the color of charred peat, and eyes the color of lichen, green with a hint of silver. The most beautiful and unique eyes he'd ever seen. Eyes that were filled with wisdom and truths a lass her age should not have known. She'd been only 14 when he met her, and he 16. And still she was the reason he'd never agreed to any of the matches his father attempted to create, beyond the fact that any marriage his father arranged for him would go against God himself. Nay, the moments they'd shared all those years ago were what kept him warm at night, kept him moving when he was wounded. Her eyes guided him in times of sorrow, and the slight curve of her pink lips when she smiled made him pause to enjoy the smaller things in life. But this was most inconvenient for him, and he quickly found himself torn in 2 different directions. His mission for the king was not to save Cora for a second time. His mission was to find Ughtred and put him down, to be rid of the menace that plagued his clan and Scotland, to ensure that any other Sassenachs who thought to take it upon themselves to marry a Scottish noblewoman in order to gain power had those notions squashed at the sight of Ughtred being punished by Liam and his men. His mission was to toss the nearly lifeless sack of Ughtred's body into the dungeon at Stirling, before gathering his men to take back Ross Castle from Ughtred and Ina's minions. A prize for the king once more after all the labours he'd had to endeavour against the wayward clan. Those were his orders, and by following them, Liam would maintain his reputation as the greatest warrior in all the land, and saviour of the people. He'd leave behind a legacy unmatched by any other battles he'd waged yet. But held in his hands were words written with splotches of ink, smeared lettering, showing it was scratched out not only in fear but in a frenzy. Cora was in trouble. Flashes of her frightened face filled the space behind his eyes, joined with the lad's warning that his mistress might be dead already. His heart squeezed hard, almost to the point of pain. Never had he imagined that his life could circle back to him like this. How could he risk a detour to save her? And how could he not save her? The woman was in distress, and no matter how long ago it had been, or how young he'd been when he'd pledged to always protect her, he couldn't go back in it now, especially when any distress she was in now was his fault, for he'd turned away from her at every chance he had to grasp on tight, and yet he risked the mission his king had given him, risked the trust his sovereign had put in him. For a woman, there was no doubt he would never be trusted again. As the second son of a powerful laird and earl in the Highlands of Scotland, Liam had spent the better part of his life proving he was every bit worthy of being Magnus Sutherland's son, and as good a warrior, if not better. Not that his father had ever made him feel less or doubt himself, but when one was born to a legend, one must not only live up to expectations but also surpass them. He was Liam Sutherland, distinguished Highland warrior. There was a reason his father had chosen him to lead their army during battles, a reason that Liam was the one selected to go up against challenges on the list field during tournaments, a reason why the king had picked him, trusted him, with this very important mission. And yet a vow was a vow, and a man was only as good as his word. He muttered an expletive from deep within his throat. "Change of plans." Liam nodded at Tad. "Put the lad back on his horse." The lad looked at him with terror and doubt. Liam held out his hand. "Sir Liam Sutherland, I will answer her summons." Eyes wide as the targes attached to their saddles gazed at him. "You are he?" The lad's voice was so breathy he seemed to be on the verge of passing out cold. "Aye." Liam gritted his teeth. How was he going to explain this? How was he going to explain the secrets he'd kept? The men knew better than to argue with Liam's decision, and none showed any sign of questioning him. They trusted him. And good thing, because Liam wasn't prepared to answer any of their queries with regards to the lass. That being said, he was certain Tad was going to probe the hell out of him later, because Tad was his closest friend, and even the best warrior needed someone to question him now and then. Hell, he didn't even know what he'd say, for he was uncertain of it all himself. All he knew was that he had to go. There wasn't a choice. "Let us go, afore it's too late," he said to his men, and the lad, "Get your wits about ye, for ye will lead us." "Aye, sir." The lad nodded emphatically, scrambling to take up his reins. He stared up at Liam with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Go on, then. We've no time to lose. But dinna get yourself killed. Take it easy on the horse." Liam indicated the road, and the lad urged his horse into a gallop, with Liam and his men following at a more reasonable pace than when the lad had come barreling toward them to begin with. All the while, lichen-coloured eyes haunted his memory. What would she look like now? Was she still as beautiful? Of course she was. Even in her youth she'd been striking, and not because he'd seen her flying over a moor as though trying to outrun an avalanche. Not because when he'd caught up to her, she had indeed flown over the head of her horse, and he'd barely caught her before she broke her neck. In the dark of the woods he'd kissed her, his first kiss, and had sworn never to kiss another, a declaration he'd failed at miserably. Every time he'd kissed another, he'd thought of her. Well, he wouldn't fail at this. He told her in no uncertain terms that if she ever needed him, he would be there for her, that she need only call on him. Liam had regretted leaving her in the care of the priest all those years ago when he'd hidden her in a kirk, even though she'd insisted. And every day since he'd expected to hear the call for him to return and collect her. In fact, he'd desired it. Each day he'd grown more disappointed when it didn't come, and yet he'd not gone to get her either. Each time he'd crossed the borders of Scotland into England, he'd thought about her, and taken the long way to get where he needed to go just in case he might spot her. He never did. But every glossy dark-haired lass caught his attention and made the space inside his ribs pound with anticipation, only to drop with disappointment when it wasn't her. Och, how his father would have raged if he'd returned to the Highlands with an English lass in tow. Not because his father despised English lasses. After all, Liam's own mother was none other than the daughter of an English baron. But because his father always said he had grand plans for Liam, to marry into a clan where he could become laird himself. Magnus Sutherland believed his son deserved to be a leader in his own right, Liam felt what he had was enough. He led men in battle. He had no need to lord over them in title too. Besides, Liam had thwarted his father's grand plans 13 years before, only his father was none the wiser for it. Well, he'd be wise to it soon enough. And so would his king. The consequences of his actions as a youth were coming back at the absolutely worst time. But he'd not have it any other way. He was more than willing to face the wrath of his father and king. He only hoped Cora was ready for it when the time came. Because this time, no matter how much she pleaded, Liam wasn't going to leave her behind. The lass had better get used to that now. Aye, because Liam took his vows very seriously. Chapter 3. Cora woke up shivering in the dark. She'd finished the food and wine from the sack the day before, and with nothing to warm her save a few blankets, the cell she'd placed herself in had grown very cold. When she touched the stone walls that made up her darkened coffin, they were slick with condensation, and she imagined them freezing overnight into ice. Spring had yet to turn into the warmer days of summer, but even then, their castle in the north of England was often draughty. They kept the fires lit in the hearth all through the day, and at night she sometimes needed to put heated stones at the foot of her bed. This little nook behind the shelf in her father's study was no different than the rest of the castle, though right now it seemed even worse. Blasts of chilly air came from the cracks, and with no place to escape, they washed over her skin, prickling her nerves and keeping her teeth chattering. She held her hands to her face, blew hot breath into them and rubbed them, wrapped like a cocoon in the blankets, but nothing seemed to help. From rationing out the food, by her guess, she'd been in the nook for 3 or 4 days now. Every night, she'd chanced a moment to sneak from the coffin-like nook to seek warmth in the banked hearth of her father's study. But she dared not press her luck more than the few minutes it took to thaw out, and use the hidden chamber pot. Last night she'd left the empty jug and satchel hidden in the wooden basket by the hearth, in hopes one of the servants would see it and refill it for her. There'd been no rescue yet, not that she'd expected one. Even if her missive did reach Liam, it would be a month before he was here. His castle in the Highlands was at least a fortnight's ride away, which meant her messenger wouldn't even arrive there for over a se'nnight, if he made it at all. The lad had been brave, but she didn't even know if he'd made it past the garderobe. There was no way for her to know. Already she was doubting her plan. By the time Liam left, if he ever did, she'd be a frozen corpse, and this her grave, and then what a waste of time for him to have come all this way. Perhaps a smarter lady would have left, saved herself, but Cora couldn't in good conscience abandon her mother. Years she'd waited for him. She didn't even know if he was still alive. She imagined him riding over the grassy fields of her father's land, his dark hair waving in the breeze, as it had when she'd very first caught a glimpse of him. Even as a lad he'd been impressive to behold. His prowess and strength would be all for naught if he came to save her and she was already dead. Cora rubbed her temples. This was no way to think. Since when had she become one to wallow in self-pity? This was not like her. But when the blasted devil had seized their castle, storming in and destroying all she'd known, Cora had thought her world was over. She still believed it. Her father's blood seeping into the straw and dirt of their bailey had leached all hope from her. The vision of her mother being knocked down. Cora swallowed hard past the lump in her throat and gritted her teeth to get them to stop chattering. She had to get out of here. Tossing off the blankets, she prepared to stand. As if on cue, booted footsteps stomped into her father's study. Cora stilled, crouching and fearing to even move a muscle, fearing to breathe. "Where the bloody hell is it?" The voice was that of the same man who'd stormed about in her father's study for days. She couldn't be certain at the time because there were no windows to look out of, but she surmised it was night when the castle was completely quiet. That meant the vile man wasn't sleeping. A fearful thought lanced through her. If it had been a few minutes later, he would have caught her standing in the center of her father's study. Cora covered her mouth with her hands to keep from making any sound when she wanted to scream, to wake from this nightmare. Perhaps it would have been better to try and escape before, even if it meant possible death. Too late now. Hidden behind the wall, she cowered. Her heart thudded so hard she feared cracking a rib. He moved things on the shelves just inches from her face, dumping her father's precious and priceless books on the floor. Like the little box of coins, her father had many things hidden in the books. Not the more priceless pieces of literature, but the ones he had fashioned to look like them. His treasure, he called them. Soon enough, in the light, when all the books had crashed to the floor, whoever it was on the other side of her hiding place would wonder if anything was hidden behind the wood paneling. They would peer through the cracks and see her there. Cora did not believe she would be lucky enough to escape his scrutiny in that case. What was it he was looking for anyway? What could her father have possibly held in his books that would warrant his murder and the imprisonment of her mother? What would this madman do when he found her? She shuddered at the thought, having heard plenty of horror stories and having lived through a siege once before. Brutal men were not kind to women, especially not youthful, virginal ladies. Not that she was that youthful anymore, given she'd recently passed her 26th summer. She was only lucky to have escaped their brutality 13 blessed years before, and she doubted she'd be so lucky again. That time she'd not been starving, or hidden in a nook behind a thick set of shelves. Before, she'd been able to escape, because of the clever ruse Liam had created in the forest to distract the men away from her. Just before then, they'd been quite explicit about what they planned to do to her. If not for Liam, she wouldn't be here cowering now. His quick thinking all those years before had allowed her the few seconds she'd needed to run away from her castle's attackers. She hadn't even known who he was, or seen him, only understood that with the men distracted she could run. And when she'd run blindly through the fields, it was there she'd met the Scottish lad who'd saved her life and pledged himself to her forevermore. Even at the tender age of 13, she'd known that to make him honor that vow would be heartless, a torment on both their parts. So, when they'd said their goodbyes, she'd sworn not to contact him, not to make him keep his promise. Not until now. Now she'd called upon him and prayed he was still alive. Oh, dear heavens, what if he wasn't alive? That thought had never crossed her mind before. He was a warrior, after all, and a daring one, if she recalled. Warriors were lucky to live to their 30th year, and he had to be nearing that. Worse still, what if she were to be the cause of his demise? What if he was killed because she'd summoned him into dangerous territory? Cora flattened her back to the wall, the cool stone seeping into her skin, a balm instead of a chill. To think this way would not do. What was she helping by giving in to these dark thoughts? Nothing. They only served to spiral her deeper into despair. She had to have hope, had to believe she would come out of this safe. Beyond the thick wooden slats in front of her came a loud crash. Was he knocking furniture over now? Flipping her father's prized desk? To what end? Cora imagined the wood splintering, and the carefully carved wolves on the thick spindles cracking at the neck and being decapitated. There was another crash and a string of curses. Cora wanted to let out a string of curses of her own, to fling them right in his face. "My lord!" Cora perked up now, forcing her thoughts at bay. It was another man who spoke, addressing the boor who'd been tearing apart the study. "What is it? Did you find it?" The surly man's question came out more of an accusation. "Nay, my lord, we've not found it. I was but worried when I heard the crashing." This last word was drawled out, and Cora imagined the soldier eyeing the destruction. Was he judging his lord? Was the man indeed touched in the head? Another crash shuddered the walls around her. "Do not deign to interrupt me again, unless it is to tell me you found it." He sounded like a petulant child in a fit of rage over losing a toy. If only he would mention what it was he was looking for, so she didn't feel so left in the dark over it. "Bring me the whiskey from the cellars," he demanded. Oh, please, nay. She wanted him to leave, had hoped that when the castle quieted, she could sneak out of her hiding spot and see if any servants had left her a crust of bread. Her stomach pained her as it squeezed, hungry and thirsty. The second man's steps retreated, and Cora fully expected the lord to go into a rage again, but it sounded as though he'd slumped down in a chair instead. Well, that was at least a temporary relief, as he'd not yet discovered her hiding spot. Maybe she'd get lucky, and he'd suffer an apoplexy in his next fit, and she'd be free. Was it a sin to pray for someone's demise? Guilt riddled her at wishing ill health on someone. Then again, he had murdered her father, and, heaven help her, she prayed he'd not done the same to her mother. It was self-defense, she was certain, for if she did come out now, he would be quick to see to her end. Actually, she was certain he would not be quick at all. "Where did you hide it?" the man shouted. Cora looked up in the dark of her cell, half expecting to see him staring through at her, accusingly. Hunger, fear, and lack of sleep were making her brain fuzzy. He couldn't be speaking to her. He didn't even know she was in here. Nay, he was asking the spirit of her father. She shuddered again, rubbing at the gooseflesh on her arms. She wanted to shout for him to leave her father alone. Hadn't he done enough when he'd run him through? They'd not even been able to give him a proper burial. For all she knew, her father still lay in the center of the bailey in a pool of his own blood. Fresh tears sparked, but this time they weren't filled with sadness or self-pity. Instead, they were filled with righteous anger. She curled her fingers into fists, her nails digging into her palms, and she bared her teeth in the dark. Unfurling one fist, Cora reached for the dagger strapped around her thigh right above the knee. The firmness of the weapon tucked into its sheath was reassuring. She tugged it free, letting the cool flatness of the side of the metal blade slide over her fingertips. She touched the tip, reassured of its sharpness. If they discovered her, at least she could use this. She'd fight to the death if she had to, injure them at the very least. Cora wasn't naturally a fighter, but she had no problem protecting herself. She'd made sure of that after what had happened in her youth. Never again had she wanted to be left helpless. Well, at least, she wanted to hurt whoever dared harm her first. Every landowner had to deal with skirmishes, and her father was a wealthy baron on the border of an enemy country. There'd been plenty of battles, but her father had always won. That was likely what had made him confident enough to believe them safe when their castle had been besieged all those years ago. Either that, or he'd been naive to expect it not to happen. Though there had been warnings. There had to have been. He'd gone to meet the king, taking his wife and young sons with him. Cora had been recovering from an illness, and had not been strong enough to travel. Because he'd had his heirs with him, her father had taken the majority of his guards. He'd wanted his legacy safe should they be attacked on the road, which was not uncommon given they were so close to the border, and the English and Scots had been fighting for as long as anyone could remember. But to understand that, and not that a castle left nearly defenseless was open to attack, Cora had never been able to wrap her head around that logic. Only a few days had passed before an army of Scots had lined up outside the gates, demanding entry. Her few men had fought valiantly, but it wasn't enough. They'd been besieged, and she was about to become a feast for the beasts when a distraction, and attack from beyond the castle walls in the woods, had allowed her enough time to escape. And that was when she'd first met Liam Sutherland. He'd whisked her up off the ground where she ran through the fields and taken her to safety. Never mind that he was Scots and she was English. Never mind that they should be enemies. He was clearly not with those who'd attacked. From that day forward, she'd promised herself she would never be vulnerable again. She'd enlisted the help of her father's most trusted guards, and they taught her quietly, for her parents would never have agreed that a woman should learn skills to protect herself. She wasn't good with a sword, nor a bow, but she could jab the blazes out of anyone who dared come too close. Perhaps the guards had pitied her since her father had thought so little of her safety when he'd left her vulnerable all those years ago. It didn't matter. She considered everything that happened to her a lesson, a way to build upon and improve herself. A large crash and the floorboards shaking beneath Cora tore her from her thoughts. The madman on the other side of the door was bellowing now, words she couldn't comprehend. His booted heels were dancing around the room in hurried and furious leaps, and more men were coming, running, shouting. And then she smelled it. Smoke. The man had lit the room on fire somehow. "Mary, Mother of God," Cora groaned. She was going to die here, hidden in her little nook, burned up when no one to ever find. Nay, she wasn't. She would escape, push past them, stab them if necessary. Maybe in the chaos they wouldn't notice the wall moving and a woman slipping out. Maybe they would be too worried about the flames to care if they did spot her. Would ignore her if she went to the dungeon to free her mother. Her limbs, too long cramped in one position, screamed as she stood. With the dagger still clutched in her hand, Cora dragged in a deep breath. It was now or never, escape or die, and she wasn't in the mood for dying. She'd hidden here to begin with in order to survive, even if hiding for a little while made her feel like a coward. She swayed on her feet, a reaction to the smoke, the lack of food and water, the blood rushing all around her body when for so long she'd hardly breathed. A few feet from her, men were in a mad dash to put out a fire, the same men who could also mean her death. Biting her lip and clutching the dagger in one hand, she felt along the panelled wall for the latch that would open the door to her hiding place, and let all the demons inside. Chapter 4. They smelled the thick smoke rising in the air before they saw the flames that licked at the castle like a ravenous wild beast. Orange-flamed tongues slithered through the windows, stroking up the sides of the stones. The thatched roof was ablaze, and it lit up the night sky. From deep within his chest, the messenger let out a strangled sound. Liam's gut clenched, but no sound came out, for he was no longer breathing. At this distance they couldn't hear anyone screaming, nor could he make out whether anyone was attempting to put out the fire. Either it was because they were truly too far to tell, or they were too late. In the valley below was a quaint castle, from what Liam could recount from memory. Its moderate wall was surrounded by a moat, and as they drew closer, he could see in the light of the flames that the drawbridge was down, the portcullis raised, gates wide open, inviting in anyone who wished. Blast it all! Liam had held out hope he'd be able to rescue Cora when they arrived, that she would be well hidden. But a fire! And this wasn't a small blaze. It was a wicked and untamed demon. The keep itself was perhaps only 4 or 5 stories high, and narrow with outbuildings pressed up against the walls. 2 other low and long buildings sat on either side of the keep. Perhaps the stables and the kitchen. And just outside the walls stood the kirk, as though God's house would protect those inside the walls should the enemy come. What little good it did them now. What little good any of it did her. A barrage of self-deprecation pummeled inside him, his biggest regret being that he hadn't insisted on bringing her back to the Highlands with him all those years ago. Though he'd not been the one to seize her castle or start the fire, he was partially to blame for her death by not claiming her as he should have. Grief the likes of which he'd never experienced lanced his insides. Mokriach. He'd not known he possessed such depth of feeling. Liam urged his horse faster over the darkened fields, rushing headlong toward a castle filled with an unfamiliar enemy. As they drew closer, he could make out the sounds of men shouting and the occasional scream of a woman or terror-filled child. Men flooded from the keep into the bailey. Perhaps they weren't too late after all. "The flames are fresh," Liam said, his voice sounding tight. "We need to help." As they urged their horses into a flying pace, He wondered if those in the bailey were the inhabitants of the castle or the enemy Cora had spoken of in her letter. From what he understood, she'd sent the messenger out only a few days before. The scent of smoke grew stronger, enough to constrict Liam's throat and burn his eyes. No matter how many water buckets they possessed, they would not have enough to put out the blaze. The castle would be consumed. To the devil with the castle. He only cared about Cora. If there was any chance she was still alive, he had to know, had to get to her, save her. Their horses thundered over the drawbridge, stunning those in the bailey who were frantically tossing water at the flames, as if trying to spit on the hearth and bank the fire. Liam couldn't decipher those who belonged from those who didn't, save for those few dressed in armor. One thing was certain, though. They were all English. Though he and his men might not appear Scots in their plain garb, it was evident to anyone who might look at them that they were deadly warriors. And more than one person tossed fearful looks their way, as though they weren't already in hell and were about to be besieged all over again. Liam didn't bother with pretenses. He drew his sword and bellowed over the roar of the inferno, "Where is she?" Everyone stilled, shocked not only by his demand, but probably also by his very Scots brogue. Perhaps they didn't know whether they should draw their own swords or run. One thing was clear. None of them appeared concerned with putting out the fire any more, not that their efforts had done much anyway. No one answered. Rage ignited in Liam's gut, flaming out hotter than the blaze devouring the castle before him. He leapt from his horse, grabbed the first armored Sassenach he could reach, easily towering a foot over him. He lifted him off the ground, growling, "Where is she?" He bellowed again, this time enunciating the words. He tossed the bastard to the ground and marched toward the next. Right when his fingers brushed the cool mail of his collar, someone called out, "In the dungeon!" This only appeared to gain a few grumbling acknowledgments, including a frantic nod from the man he was now holding up in the air. "Go to her!" Liam demanded of the Englishman closest to him. The man shook his head. "I'll die doing it." "You'll die if ye dinna." The man dropped to his knees. "Better to die by the sword than to die by the flames." Liam's mouth fell open in exasperation. Quick as a whip, Liam knocked the hilt of his dagger against the man's temple and tossed him aside. "Tad!" he shouted. "Dispatch of the besiegers!" Liam could feel the heat of the fire on his skin, causing sweat to pool on the surface of his limbs, his brow. The roar and crackle of the flames was loud, echoing in his skull and bouncing off the one thing he kept repeating. Find her, find her, find her. "Where is the dungeon?" He didn't demand of anyone in particular, his glower enough to get mouths moving. The messenger lad hurried to his side, tugging on Liam's sleeve as he attempted to march toward the flaming keep. "Just in there, sir. Through the doors and to the left. There's a hole in the ground covered by an iron grate." With the smoke rising into the air rather than settling near the ground, Liam hoped the lass was safe in the dungeon, at risk only of anything falling through the grate. Liam grabbed a soaked leather bucket of water from the ground where someone had abandoned it, and doused himself over the head. The moisture soaked into his hair, shirt and trews. Better to be wet when in the presence of flames than dry as kindling. Tad took control of the situation outside the castle, and Liam was confident his friend would be able to handle anything presented to him. "I'll come with you," the lad bravely offered, when Liam shook off his hold on his sleeve. "Ye'll do no such thing. Your lady bids ye only deliver a message. Your duty is complete, and I'll not have ye killing yourself on my watch. Go and help your people." Liam didn't wait to argue with him further, and so he ignored the sputtering from the lad. He rushed up the stairs of the keep. His feet pounding the stones drowned out the roaring of the flames and the moaning of the castle as it succumbed. From within he could hear beams and floorboards crashing. This was madness. He could die. But he'd made a promise, and he was nothing without his word. He ducked into the keep, and heat immediately surrounded him. Flames leapt from everywhere, the smoke attempting to suffocate him. Floorboards from above splintered, caving in and spilling the contents of the upper floors onto floors below, creating massive piles of flaming furniture. It was a raging inferno, the worst he'd ever seen. What the bloody hell had started such a fire? The only thing not burning was the stone floor he stood on and the outer stone walls, though they blackened in long swathes of dark from the base upward. Following the lad's directions, he went to the left. Visibility was low. Smoke burned his eyes and scorched his lungs. He lifted the collar of his shirt over his mouth in an attempt to keep the heat from searing his insides as he breathed. He searched the ground for the grate with his feet, hoping to scrape the tip of his boot on something that wasn't stone or wood. When he found it, the covering had already been slit open. Had someone got to her already? Had she somehow managed to climb out herself? Was it possible? Nay, it wasn't. He would have seen her. He had to believe that despite all this time apart, if she saw him racing into a burning castle, she wouldn't simply allow him to keep going. The weight of the covering alone would be enough to make a grown man strain, let alone a woman. Not to mention it had to be sizzling to the touch. Just to check his theory, Liam knelt and touched the tip of a finger to the iron. It singed his skin, sending a jerk of pain up his arm. "Bollocks!" he ground out. The dungeon was nothing more than a hole in the ground, the abysmal chasm yawning wide and daring him to leap inside. A groan sounded from deep within the dark cavern. Even the blinding light of the flames didn't illuminate the hall of death. A spectre or a person? He guessed the latter. Pressing his hands to either side of the hole, he let his shirt drop from his face and dipped his head below. "Cora!" he shouted into the cavern. He could see nothing, but he was relieved to find the smoke was less here. A groan came once more from below. His only answer. Was it she? Damn it, he didn't know, and it didn't matter. He was here and someone was down there. It was his duty to protect, a sacred oath that every warrior knight across all realms took to heart. Unless, of course, they were vile, rotten bastards like the one who'd taken her castle and set it to flames. Well, if it were Cora in the hole, she'd not have been able to move that grate on her own, which could mean a rescue attempt had already been made and failed. There was no ladder and no rope, nothing that wasn't on fire that he could grab hold of, so the opening of the grate was only a jest of death. Unsure of how deep the chasm went, Liam couldn't very well leap into it without a rope or ladder to get back out, which meant he had to leave for a moment. "I'll be right back. I'm here, Cora. I'm going to get ye out." With an expletive, Liam ran back outside. Tad had put an easy end to most of the enemy. One man knelt before him, tied at the wrists. He had to guess this was the ringleader. Why else would Tad and his men have spared the man's life unless they were saving the kill for Liam? Good lads they were. "Tad!" Liam shouted. Without further explanation to his friend, Liam ran back inside toward the grate, toward Cora. "I'm going to get ye out of there," he said. There was no answer. Tad appeared a breath later, his shirt over his face, and concern etched in the crease between his brows. "I'm going in," Liam said. "Help the lass out when I hand her to ye." "Aye." "I'm coming down," Liam called into the darkness. "Move to the side so I dinna crush ye." Though no shuffling sounds were made from below, neither were there any more groans, so he continued with his plan, hoping he didn't end up dropping on top of someone. With his feet dangling inside and his hands braced on either side of the man-sized hole, he lowered himself down. Even with his great height hanging from the top, his feet didn't touch. Bollocks. He had no idea how far down it went, and he just had to hope it wasn't another 10 feet. He let go, bracing for the fall and praying it wasn't more than 10 or 12 feet, so he couldn't jump up to take hold of Tad's extended hand. Thankfully, he only fell perhaps a foot or so before landing on his feet. a height just enough to taunt any man or woman tossed down deep with the idea that if they jumped high enough, they might be able to get themselves out. Liam drew in a steady breath and coughed. The air was dank and smelled of human waste and despair. "Cora!" he said, followed by another cough. Liam bent forward, swishing the air with his hands, intent on finding her in the dark. He couldn't see a damn thing. With slow, shuffled steps forward, he felt for her, and finally his fingertips brushed a soft head of hair and petite feminine shoulders. "I'm going to help ye," he said. A crash sounded from above, and Tad shouted a curse. A whoosh of smoke filled the room. The castle was falling down around them. Bloody hell. Liam wasted no time. He wrapped his arms around her waist and hauled her up over his shoulder as he stood up straight. The lass was heftier than he recalled, which didn't mean much, since he'd last seen her when she was a girl. She let out a groan. He trudged back to the light of the hall where Tad waited with his arms dangling down. Liam braced his feet, pressed both hands around her waist, and hoisted her overhead. Tad took hold of her and pulled her out swiftly. He made ready to jump and grab hold of the ledge when another groan sounded from behind him. What the? Liam whirled, warrior's instinct on high alert, prepared for an attack. A body fell against his leg, limp, and would have fallen all the way to the ground if he'd not held on. The slight figure was that of another woman. "You came," she murmured, her voice dry and cracked. "Cora?" If this was she, who the hell had he lifted out of the dungeon? But she didn't answer. "Liam!" Tad shouted. "Ceiling's collapsing!" "I've got another!" Mind reeling, Liam lifted her up over his shoulders until Tad took hold to get her out too. Once she was clear of the opening, he jumped and grabbed hold of the ledge and used his strength to raise himself from the dungeon. Once he was out, he could see instantly what had Tad shouting. The roof of the great hall had caved in. Great heaping piles of cracking wood were melting under the intense heat. In fact, the temperature of this part of the castle versus the dungeon was markedly different. Tad was already running, the first woman over his shoulder. Liam lifted the second one, not bothering to look at her face, as he too made haste to follow. He leapt over a fallen beam, feeling the heat reach out to touch his legs with the threat of burning. He ducked beneath a falling tapestry that seemed intent on covering them both in wicked flames. The second before he was out, another loud crash sounded from behind, and a whoosh of heat thrust him forward as more of the roof crashed down. It was enough of a blast that Liam was propelled headlong out of the castle and down the steps. Somehow his protective instincts managed to kick in, and he cradled the woman in his arms to protect her from hitting the stone steps as he fell, taking the brunt of the fall himself. Pain seared in his shoulder, and the wind was knocked out of him when their brutal descent ended on the soft earth of the bailey. Laying at the foot of the stairs, he was uninjured except for a few bruises and a stabbing pain near his heart. Besides, all that mattered was the lass was safe, right? Liam drew in several steadying breaths, willing the ache in his chest to dull. He glanced down at the face of the woman cradled in his arms, seeing an older version of the lass she'd been years before. Cora. Still beautiful, achingly so. A large bruise marred her cheek, the same spot from 13 years before, as though she'd never healed. Her eyes were closed. Black sooty lashes fanned out over her cheeks. Her skin was pale. Soot and muck streaked her skin. Her gown was torn, covered in soot and singed in parts. An overwhelming urge to cradle her close, to protect her, crowded him. "Cora." He touched the outline of the bruise on her cheek. "Weak." But she didn't obey his command. Stubborn as she'd been all those years before, she kept her eyes closed and curled in further toward him. From a few feet away, another woman, the one he'd first lifted from the depths of despair, crawled forward. She was an older version of the lass in his arms, her chestnut hair filled with grey, and eyes more the colour of fall leaves than lichen, yet still the resemblance was undeniable. Her mother. "My lady," Liam said to her, "you saved us." A cough racked her body, and she collapsed beside him. She reached for her daughter's hand, which caused Cora to scream and clutch her hands to herself. "'Tis all right, lass," he crooned. Dear God, what had happened to her? "No one will hurt ye now." Tears slipped from the corners of her closed eyes, and when her mother reached for her again, once more Cora pulled away. Liam narrowed his gaze, feeling the way her body trembled against his own. She tugged deep, ragged breaths into her lungs, and then blew them out raspily. This was much more than simple fear. She was injured. With some soothing and coaxing, Liam managed to pull one hand from her chest by delicately holding onto her forearm. Bloody hell! The skin of her palms and fingers were badly seared. Charred flesh surrounded gaping wounds. Liam had seen a lot of horrendous injuries in his day, but this was ghastly. He cringed, sucked in a breath through his teeth, and let out a curse. "We need a healer," he called out, hoping the fear in his voice didn't scare her all the more. But where would they find a healer in a burning castle that had been besieged? The servants had to have escaped long ago, either when the first man laid siege to them, when flames filled the castle, or when Liam and his men had arrived, and they'd seen no hope but a future in chains. They would have been wrong, but he'd come to this castle for one thing only: Cora. And their lady needed a healer. Liam let out another curse, his chest pounding. In the end, none of her people stepped forward, but one of his own did. Lucas, a warrior whose mother was a healer of their clan, and who had studied with her since he was a child. He often travelled with Liam when they went on missions and into battle, just in case his expertise was needed. He was never more grateful than now that Lucas had insisted on coming. Lucas dropped to his knees beside them and gazed down at the angry, charred stripes. "How could she have been burned in such a way?" Lucas mused softly. Studying the white stripes, Liam knew. She must have tried to lift the grate to the dungeon. Was it possible she had indeed lifted the heavy piece of iron? "Why would she do a thing like that?" Lucas asked. "And how?" Tad mumbled. "Saving me," the woman lying beside him croaked, as one of the other Sutherland warriors knelt to give her a drink from his flask. Lips parted, the older woman greedily drank, her hands clutching onto the generous warrior for more. "She wasna in the dungeon with ye?" Liam asked. The woman shook her head, gripping the wineskin with two hands as she poured more of the contents down her throat. "Brave lass," Liam said, and he wasn't surprised at her bravery. He'd known when he met her there was a resilience in her that would make others cower with shame. But the strength she must possess to lift that iron was puzzling. Sheer force of determination had to have been what helped her lift that grate. Else he had no idea how she could have done it. The bloody thing had to weigh as much as she did, and it was so hot it had literally burned the flesh from her hands. He'd heard men in battle had been able to lift horses off their dying comrades, to wrench up a heavy portcullis, or continue to fight
He groaned in the back of his throat. "Christ, I'm gonna be sick." Kovac moved to block the path to the bathroom, but Fallon went for the kitchen instead and straight out the back door. Kovac started to follow, then pulled up as the head of the crime scene unit walked in the front door. Just as well. By the time he was able to join Neil Fallon on the back steps, any gastrointestinal pyrotechnics had subsided. Fallon stood leaning against the railing, staring at the backyard, sipping out of a slim metal flask. His skin looked slightly gray, his eyes rimmed in red. He didn't acknowledge Kovac's presence, but pointed to a naked oak tree in the far corner of the yard. "That was the hanging tree," he said without emotion, "when Andy and I were kids." "Playing cowboys?" "And pirates, and Tarzan, and whatever. He should have come back here and done it. Andy hanging dead in the backyard, Iron Mike in the house with his head blown off. I could have come and parked my car in the garage and gassed myself." "How'd Mike sound last night on the phone?" "Like an asshole, like always. I want to be at the goddamn funeral home by 10 o'clock. The impersonation was less than flattering, but not less than accurate. "You can damn well be here on time, fucking old prick," he muttered, and swiped a gloved hand under his running nose. "What time was that?" "I'm trying to get a frame for what happened when," Kovac explained. "We need it for the paperwork." Fallon stared at the tree and shrugged. "I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. Maybe like 9 or something." "Couldn't have been. I ran into him at your brother's house around 9. Fallon looked at him. "What were you doing there?" "Poking around. There's a couple of loose ends need tying up." "Like what? Andy hung himself. How can you have any doubts about that?" "I like to know the why of things," Kovac said. "I'm funny that way. I want to look at what he was working on, what was going on in his personal life, things like that. Fill in the blanks, get the whole picture, you see?" If Fallon saw, he didn't like it. He turned away and took another pull on the little flask. "I'm used to people dying," Kovac said. "Drug dealers kill each other over money. Junkies kill each other over dope. Husbands and wives kill each other out of hate. There's a method to the madness. Someone like your brother buys it, a guy with everything going for him. I need to try to make some sense of it. Good luck." "What did you do to your face?" Fallon tried to shake off the attention. He touched a hand to the bruise on his cheek as if to brush it away. "Nothing. Mixed it up a little in the parking lot with a customer last night." "Over what?" "He made a remark. I took exception and said something about his sexual preferences and a sheep. He took a swing and got lucky." "That's assault," Kovac pointed out. "You call the cops?" Fallon gave a nervous laugh. "That's a good one. He was a cop." "A cop? A city cop?" "He wasn't in uniform." "How'd you know he was a cop?" "Please, like I can't spot one a mile off." "Did you get a name? A badge number?" "Right. After he knocked me on my ass, I demanded his badge number. Anyway, I don't need the hassle of filing a report. He was just some asshole knew Andy. He made a crack. We took it outside." "What did he look like?" "Like half the cops in the world," Fallon said impatiently. He slipped the flask into his coat pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and went about that ritual, fumbling with his gloves, fingers clumsy with cold, or with nerves. He swore to himself, got the thing lit, took a couple of hard puffs. "Look, I wish I hadn't said anything. I don't want to do anything with it. I'd had a few myself. I got a mouth on me when I'm tanked." "Big guy, little guy, white, black, old, young?" Fallon scowled and fidgeted. He looked as if his skin suddenly didn't fit right. He wouldn't meet Kovac's gaze. "I don't even know that I'd know him if I saw him again."
"Sorry," says Hood. "I know there's no reason to argue with him, or to deny what he knows. He has seen me. Seen. Hood is Hood, and he's got the man thing. Nothing sneaky about him. It's my turn to whisper now, but the words sound so loud to me. You can't prove anything. And your sheriff buddies can't, and the DA can't. His heart beats faster and harder. I set my cheek against his chest."
"Suzanne, There's guys like Lenny and guys better than Lenny getting killed every day, while you boost cars and stick up minimum wage workers. That's disrespect.
The war used up all your forgiveness?
It used up all my something.
Hood's heart is going strong. I put my nose next to his ear, the same place I put it down in Valley Center. It's an empty feeling when your love isn't enough. It's supposed to be, but sometimes it's not. I know that Hood's past has shaped him, and that my past has shaped me. These are powerful things. You can enlist in them or rebel against them, but in your heart you always know the truth of who you are, and you cannot escape it. I begin to dress in the darkness. I can see Hood's eyes shining down there. Stars in the universe. There have been many needs inside me, some all self, and others not all self. Some that take, some that honor and make strength, some simple and some imponderable, but not like this. This is his, mine, and ours. Charlie.
Yes?
It's White.
I thought so. Talk to me.
I tell him almost everything I know. The building in Long Beach with the swank computers, White's arrangements with the ports, Rourke, White's offer of partnership. He says nothing while I talk. It's all in the notebook in my purse, I say. His address in Long Beach, a phone number, descriptions of his place, every detail I can remember, which is a lot. I'm going to leave it on the counter out there. It's more than enough to get you started. And, Charlie, White doesn't know that I know. You can surprise him.
Did you sell him the diamonds?
Not exactly. I'm finished dressing. Seems like with Hood I'm always dressing and undressing. There's a moment in the near dark when I can just barely make out his shape. I know he's watching me. I can see the glimmer in his eyes. They look like lights across a vast ocean. Goodbye, Charlie. I'm leaving something for you. I'll put it on top of the notebook.
Vaya con Dios, Suzanne. Chapter 41. Hood got back his old Region 2 patrol shift. It felt right to be in the summer weight cotton poly uniform and the law enforcement Ford. He had failed homicide, and he felt shame but some relief. Maybe someday he'd get another shot. His thoughts were often of Suzanne Jones and Reginald White, and his dreams were haunted by them.
He smiled at her expression. "Don't worry about it. Nothing's really changed. His horses are going to have to rest as often as ours." "Oh?" Her brows went up, and she drummed her fingers against the table. "What if the dead are pulling it? The dead who never need to rest? The old man can do everything but shit in the wagon, and how often are they going to stop for that?" "Not often," Geihard admitted. He swung his inside leg out over the bench and leaned back against the table. After a moment's thought, he said, "Perhaps the other wheel will fall off." "Yeah, maybe." Vree jerked her chin at the stairs leading to the loft. "This is really going to upset her. Then maybe we shouldn't tell her." It could have been Bannon sitting there, offering to share a secret with that exact glint in his eye. "Just between you and me, Vree." But it wasn't Bannon. She shook her head, uncertain of what she was refusing. "Suit yourself." Geihard stood and turned toward the door. "I'm going out to get some air." As he passed her, he rested his hand for a heartbeat on her shoulder. "He touched you. I don't like it when he touches you. I don't want him to touch you. It's your body. And just you remember that, sister mine." A skin of watered wine, a dozen cooked sausages, a hunk of cheese, a loaf of bread, and 6 peaches, Geihard murmured, pulling a peach from his pocket and rubbing at the fuzz with the ball of his thumb. Why would cars have taken peaches? 90 years before, they'd bought a basket from a trader who'd been crossing the mountains on his way to Commandia. The fruit had made cars violently ill.
But driving up to the prison, I was suddenly certain that I wouldn't come out alive. If I did, it would be in Danny's shackles because he would no longer need them. He'd be dead. Then again, maybe it really was just like that. Because we were breaking in, not breaking out, and getting into prison was very easy in the United States of America. You can check in any time you like, but you can never leave. The first gate at the perimeter fence rolled open as we approached. I sat still and tried to keep my mind on Danny as we rolled into the Sallyport. "This is it," I heard Keith say. "Just like that," I returned. "Not quite," he repeated. But it was. A deputy welcomed us, asked us to leave the rental car where it was, and then led us, briefcases in hand, along the fences to steps leading up to the arching front entrance. The massive bolts on the iron doors were drawn back. Some would say that Basel looked stately compared to other prisons, but all I saw was a glorified dungeon. I tried to imagine Danny locked away inside such a beautiful building, but I couldn't, and my mind returned to flip-flopping between just like that and impossible. Something was wrong. "No, nothing's wrong, Renee." My palms were sweating, but everything was going exactly as we'd planned it. We were breaking into Basel to save Danny. We were ushered into a reception area that reminded me of a waiting room at a doctor's office. I stood by the window, looking calm and collected with both hands clasping my briefcase, as Keith gave our badges and paperwork to the staff member on duty. I was thinking that I should do something besides stand there like a coat rack, but Keith was in charge of getting us in. The CO who'd ushered us in stood by the door patiently, watching me. I gave him a shallow smile and a nod, then averted my eyes. Did he suspect anything at all? Evidently he didn't, because he just stood there for the 5 minutes it took the clerk to process us and call for our escort. A staff member dressed in a white shirt and blue tie walked into the room and smiled. "Welcome to Basel, deputies." He reached out his hand. "Michael Banning, assistant to the warden, at your service. I understand you'd like to inspect our milk?" Keith took his hand. "Just a random inspection, no cause for alarm. We'd like to get started if that's all right with you. We have another appointment today." "Of course." He offered me his hand, and I didn't want to take it, but I did. "I'm guessing you're Julia?" "Deputy is fine," I said. He grinned wide. Well then, deputy it is. The warden is on his way down. Can I get either of you anything? Coffee? A soda? This isn't a social call, Mr. Banning, Keith said. The warden will be notified of our findings when our investigation is complete. Now, if you wouldn't mind, we'd like to get started. Of course. But I'm sure the warden would feel he'd insulted you if he didn't greet you himself. It'll just be a minute. I don't know what came over me at that moment. Maybe my fear of meeting the warden, maybe my aversion to waiting one more minute for anything when it came to Danny. But I looked into his eyes and spoke with simple authority. Do you know how much evidence can be burned in a minute, Banning? Banning. Not Mr. Banning or Michael, just Banning. He flashed another grin. Of course. It'll just be a moment. Before I could make another pass at setting him straight, the door crashed open and a tall man wearing round glasses and a black suit walked in. Who do we have the pleasure of assisting today? He boomed. This was Marshal Pape, warden of the Basel Institute. I was sure of it. Danny's
closing up his throat, choking off his breath, causing his skin to erupt in painful blisters. Juice dribbling down his chin, Guyhard leaned back against the well housing. He supposed the passage of time could have changed Cars's reaction. After all, the passage of time should have killed him and hadn't. Or perhaps it wasn't Cars they followed at all. Commandian law produced a steady progression of crippled bards. Perhaps another had torn free and joined Cars in his nest on the Empire side of the mountains long enough to learn of the Fifth Kai, and it was this bard they followed now. No. Guyhard chewed and swallowed and tasted dust. Although his head could create reason after reason why the old man who'd raised the dead around the capital was not the young man he'd abandoned to insanity long ago, his heart knew otherwise. Then why the peaches? His teeth scraped against the pit, and he started, pitched into memory. That is so incredibly sensual, the way you do that. The way I do what? Guyhard grinned and sucked the juice off the pit, holding it by his fingertips and rolling it between his lips. This. That. Cars lifted himself up on his elbows, eyes gleaming. I love to watch you eat those. It almost makes up for not being able to eat them myself. Perhaps Cars had taken the peaches in order to watch someone else eat them. But he journeyed with the dead. Or did he? All at once, it seemed there was a very good chance that His Imperial Highness Prince Ottovas was alive. Guyhard tossed the pit into the darkness and stared up at the stars. If Vree thought that the prince was alive, then the simplicity of find the prince became lost in the resumption of strike and counter-strike. They'd have to start thinking about killing each other again. He didn't want to think about killing her. And may I inquire what your business is in the capital, Commander? No. Negan sealed his message to Marshal Cella and pinched the wick of the sealing wax between thumb and forefinger. Your Marshal can if he wants to, but all you need to know is that I'm loosed at a target. He paused, then added, Commander. The woman on the other side of the desk gave no indication that she heard any insult in her visitor's husky enunciation of her rank. She'd been raised to play the political game that guarding the Emperor required, and would not be thrown out of countenance by a grimy provincial who stank of his days on the road. You're here very early, and you've obviously been riding hard. The facilities of the First Army are, of course, yours to enjoy. Her tone suggested Negan wouldn't recognize a bath if he fell into one. Negan stood and pushed the folded parchment across the desk. I want a courier sent immediately. No trouble at all, Commander. Will you be waiting at the garrison for a return message? He leaned forward slightly. No, I won't. I told you I am loosed at a target. The words brushed an edge across her throat. She swallowed and forgot to breathe as she watched him leave the duty room, cross the portico, and disappear behind the bulk of a painted pillar. All at once she understood why the First Army trained no one to wear a black sunburst. The assassins were weapons to be used when a single blade could decide the course of a battle. They had no defensive use, and the First Army existed for the sole purpose of defending the imperial family. Commander Negan was a weapon unsheathed. She wondered what battle he was deciding, and a not entirely unpleasant frisson lifted the hair on the back of her neck. It's like having Death herself walking around the city. He'd been to the capital once, many years ago, but he'd forgotten how big it was, how many people crammed within the circle of its wall. A pair of assassins
of a dead body never failed to bring out the scavengers. According to the press, the people had a right to know about the tragedies of strangers. You want me to handle them? Liska asked. No. I'll give them a statement, he said, thinking about the life and times of Mike Fallon, the pain, the loss, the soured love and wasted chances. How's this? Life's a bitch and then you die. Liska arched a brow and spoke with heavy sarcasm. Yeah, there's a headline. She started to go back inside. Kovac stopped her with a question. Hey, Tinks, when you saw Ogden this morning, did he look like he'd been in a fight? No, why? Next time you see him, ask him what the hell he was doing out at Neil Fallon's bar last night. See if you get a rise. Liska looked unhappy. He was at Fallon's bar? Maybe. Fallon claims some cop was out there making cracks and they mixed it up in the parking lot. Did he describe Ogden? No. He dropped his little bomb, then clammed up. He acts like a man who's scared of something. Like retribution, maybe. Why would Ogden go all the way out there? What would be the point? Even if, God, especially if, he had something to do with Andy Fallon or with the Curtis murder. Go out there and pick a fight with Neil Fallon? Not even Ogden is that stupid. That's what I'm thinking. And the next logical question is, then why would Neil Fallon lie about it if it didn't happen? Neil Fallon, whose father is sitting in the bathroom missing the back of his head? Neil Fallon, who was seething with long-held hard feelings. Neil Fallon, who had admitted to a quick, harsh temper. Neil Fallon, who resented his brother and hated his father even after their deaths. Let's do a little digging on Mr. Fallon, Kovac said. Put Elwood on it if he's not busy. I'll talk to some of Fallon's customers. See if anyone else saw this phantom cop. Will do. Kovac took one last grim look at the hanging tree. Make sure the ME's people bag Mike's hands. We could be looking at a murder after all. Chapter 17. It wouldn't be a cop funeral like the ones shown on the 6 o'clock news. The church would not overflow with ranks of uniforms who had rolled in from all over the state. There would be no endless caravan of radio cars to the cemetery. No one was going to play Amazing Grace on the bagpipes. Andy Fallon had not fallen in the line of duty. His death had not been heroic. The place didn't even look like a church, Kovac thought, as he left the car in the lot and walked toward the low brick building. Like most churches built in the 70s, it looked more like a municipal building. Only the thin, stylized iron cross on the front gave it away. That and the illuminated sign out near the boulevard. St. Michael's. Advent. Waiting for a miracle? Mass, weekdays 7 a.m., Saturday 5 p.m., Sunday 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. As if miracles were performed regularly at those scheduled hours. The hearse was sitting on the circle drive near the side entrance. No miracles for Andy Fallon. Maybe if he had come here Saturday at 5. The wind whipped Kovac's coat around his legs. He bent his head into it to keep his hat. The wind chill was in the teens. Mourners moved toward the church from scattershot spots in the parking lot. Cop. 3 civilians together, a man and 2 women in their late 20s. The cops were in plain clothes, and he didn't know them, but he could spot a cop as easily as Neil Fallon. It was in the carriage, in the demeanor, in the eyes, in the mustache. The usual dirge was playing on the organ as they trailed one another into the building to loiter in the narthex. Kovac renewed his promise to himself not to have a funeral when he died. His pals could hoist a few for him at Patrick's, and maybe Liska could do something with his ashes. Toss them out on the steps of City Hall to join the ashes of 1,000 cigarettes smoked there by cops every day. Seemed fitting. He sure as hell wouldn't put people through this, standing around staring at one another, listening to god-awful organ music and choking on the smell of gladiolas. He put his hat on the rack, but kept his coat, and stood off to the side watching the civilians move as a trio to another small knot of their own kind. He would approach them later, afterward, after they had all shared the experience of putting their friend in the ground. He wondered if any of them had been close enough to Andy Fallon to share a sexual paraphilia. Impossible to tell. In his experience, the most normal-seeming people could be involved in the weirdest shit. Andy Fallon's friends looked like the cream of their generation, well-dressed, clean-cut, their faces pale with grief beneath the fading red of wind-kissed cheeks. Couldn't say who was gay, who was straight, who was into S&M. The doors opened again, and Steve Pierce held one back, letting Jocelyn Daring precede him in. They made a handsome couple in expensive black cashmere coats. Jocelyn, a statuesque porcelain doll with every blonde hair neatly swept back and held in place with a black velvet bow. She may not have felt the loss of her fiancé's best friend, but she knew how to dress the part. She appeared to be pouting. Pierce stood beside her near the coat rack with a 1,000-yard stare. He didn't help her with her coat. She said something to him, and he snapped at her. Kovac couldn't make out the words, but his tone was sharp, and her reaction was to intensify the pout. They didn't touch as they went into the church. Not a happy couple. Kovac went to the glass doors and looked in at the assembled mourners. The pews were chrome, and black plastic chairs hooked one to the next. There were no kneelers, no creepy statues of the Virgin or the saints adorned with real human hair. There was nothing daunting about the place, no overriding sense of God glaring down on his terrified flock. Not like when Kovac had been a kid, when eating a burger on Friday during Lent was a sure pass to hell. He had feared and respected the church of his youth. This place was about as scary as going to a lecture at the public library. Pierce and Daring had taken seats on the center aisle about halfway toward the front. Pierce rose abruptly and came back out, the girlfriend watching him all the way. He stared at the floor, digging a cigarette and a lighter from his coat pocket as he walked. Kovac moved away from the doors. Pierce didn't see him as he crossed the narthex and went outside. Kovac followed him and took a position 3 feet to Pierce's right on the broad concrete step. Pierce didn't look at him. "I keep saying I'm quitting," Kovac said, shaking one out of a pack of Salems. He hooked it with his lip and lit it with a Christmas Bic. Nothing says Christmas like lung cancer. "But you know what? I never do. I like it. Everybody tries to make me feel guilty about it, and I buy into that. Like I think I deserve it or something. So then I say I'm quitting, but I never do." Pierce regarded him from the corner of his eye and lit his own cigarette with a slim, brushed chrome lighter that looked like a giant bullet. His hands were shaking. He returned his stare to the street and slowly exhaled. "I guess that's just human nature," Kovac went on, wishing he'd grabbed his hat on his way out. He could feel all his body heat rushing out the top of his head. "Everybody carries around a load of shit they think they ought to feel guilty about. Like somehow that makes them a better person. Like there's some law against just being who you are." "There are plenty of laws against that," Pierce said, still staring at the street. "Depending on who you are." Kovac let that hang for a moment, waited. Pierce had opened the door, just a crack. "Well, sure, if you're a prostitute or a drug dealer. Or did you mean something less obvious?" Pierce blew out a stream of smoke. "Like if you're gay," Kovac suggested. Pierce moved his shoulders and swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. "That would depend."
His feet on the ground to steady the bike as he cleared phlegm from his throat. He leaned to the side to spit out a big wad. At least he spit away from her. His gaze drifted up from her knee-high boots, up her bare, long legs and cut-off shorts, finally reaching her face. He squinted his left eye against a rising curl of smoke as he took a drag from the cigarette between his sunken lips. The glow from that long drag momentarily lit the coarse stubble covering the contours and folds of his leathery skin. He took the cigarette from his mouth with the first 2 fingers of his left hand and flicked off the ash.
"Well, well, well,"
he drawled in a raspy voice that still possessed the hint of a once tough man.
"Didn't you grow up to be as pretty as an angel?"
Angela was scowling. She had seen him panhandling in the parking lot before, but this was the first time he had ever approached her. She'd parked with her front bumper almost touching the wall of the bar. He was straddling his bike at the end of the gap between her truck and the car in the next spot. Without a word, she started to go past him. He put a hand out to lean against the side of her truck and block her path. It looked to her like the practiced reflex of a man who had used that same move to stop countless young women. "Get out of my way," she said with menace. He gestured beseechingly with the hand holding the cigarette.
"Might you give an old friend a bit of help?"
"We aren't old friends," she said. She knew what help drunks and crackheads usually wanted. She had no intention of giving him any of her money. She worked hard and didn't want what she earned going up in smoke.
"Oh, but we are,"
he said, squinting at her with the one eye without smoke in it.
"I'm Albert. I'm your father."
Angela was caught off guard for only an instant. She huffed a laugh. "Yeah, right. I don't know an Albert."
"I was a friend of your mother, Sally."
So were lots of guys. Any one of the drunks, tweakers, or dealers who hung around their trailer could have been her father. It wasn't like it would have been a rare conquest.
Production copyright 2015, Penguin Random House, LLC. All rights reserved.